Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Have you ever looked at a photograph and felt like someone or something was staring back at you? Not just through the lens, but beyond it, as if there was more to the image than you could see. That's what happened to me when I first opened my grandmother's old family album. I had never thought much of it. The album had sat untouched on a shelf in my grandmother's attic for years, gathering dust. She had told me once that it contained the history of our family, names, dates, faces. Yet, something about it had always unsettled me. The more I heard about it, the more distant the stories felt, like they belonged to someone else. That day was different. I had returned to my grandmother's house after her sudden passing, hoping to find something to hold on to, some piece of her that could explain the quiet, haunted look in her eyes. Her house was cold, even with the sunlight streaming through the windows. The air smelled faintly of old wood and mothballs, and it felt wrong. I stood in front of the shelf where the album lay. It was as if it called to me, drawing me in. I hesitated, my hand hovering just above the cover. The faintest sound echoed through the room. A creak, like a floorboard groaning underfoot. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. But no one was there. I shook the feeling off and grabbed the album. The thick leather cover was cold in my hands, and when I opened it, I was greeted by pages yellowed with age, each one filled with photographs I had never seen before. Faces stared out at me, strange faces. My great-grandparents, my grandmother's siblings, but then there were others. People I didn't recognize. Their eyes seemed too intense, too knowing, as if they held secrets too dark to speak. I flipped through the pages, my fingers brushing against the photographs, each one more unsettling than the last. There was one photo in particular, a blurry image of a man standing alone in a field, his face obscured by shadows, but his posture, something about it seemed off. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me. I snapped the album shut, feeling a sudden rush of unease. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But as I turned to leave, I thought I heard a soft whisper behind me. A voice that didn't belong to anyone in the house. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. I told myself I was imagining things. It was just the silence of the house playing with my mind. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something about that album, those photographs, was different. Something about it felt wrong. I couldn't stop thinking about the album. It was as if its weight had shifted from my hands to my mind, pressing down on me, making everything feel heavier. The whispers from before, distant and faint, yet unmistakable, kept playing in my head. Had I truly heard them, or had my mind simply been overwhelmed by the eerie silence of the house? That night, I lay in bed, unable to sleep. The darkness around me seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The house was still, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath me. The quiet was suffocating. Every breath felt too loud, every movement too deliberate. My grandmother's house, once so familiar, now felt like a stranger's home. I could almost sense the presence of something or someone watching me from the shadows. I turned over in bed, trying to shake the growing unease. I couldn't tell if the discomfort was due to the house or the album, or maybe it was both. A sudden chill ran down my spine as I recalled the photograph of the man in the field. His face had been obscured by shadows, but I could still feel his presence. His posture was unnerving, almost predatory, as if he were waiting for something or someone. I couldn't ignore the pull to go back to the attic, to look through the album again, to search for answers, to see if there were more clues hidden in the photographs. But part of me was terrified of what I might find. Still, I couldn't resist. The need for answers outweighed my fear. The next day, I climbed up into the attic, the stairs creaking beneath me with every step. The air up there was thick with dust, the smell of old paper and wood overwhelming. I paused at the threshold, my heart racing. The attic, with its piles of forgotten furniture and boxes, felt different, more oppressive. The shadows in the corners seemed to move, twisting and stretching in the dim light. I stepped forward, making my way to the shelf where the album had been. But it wasn't there. I froze, my pulse quickening. It had been right there on the shelf when I left the room just hours ago. I searched the room frantically, my eyes scanning every corner, every pile of old junk. The album had to be here. I couldn't have imagined it being there in the first place. My gaze landed on a small wooden table in the far corner, buried under a pile of old books. There, partially hidden beneath a faded tablecloth, was the album. But this time, it wasn't just the album that caught my attention. A photograph lay next to it, face down. I picked it up, my hands trembling. It was another photo I hadn't seen before, an old black and white image of a house. The same house I was standing in. But in the picture, the house looked different. There was a dark, foreboding figure standing in front of it, just out of the light's reach. The shadows seemed to consume him, stretching out like tendrils, his face completely obscured by darkness. I turned the photograph over. Written in neat, faded handwriting was a name, Elias Whitaker. Below the name, in a smaller, almost indecipherable scroll, were the words, "The shadows never forget." The phrase made my stomach twist. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. Who was Elias Whitaker? And what did the shadows have to do with anything? My breath quickened as I looked back at the album. There had to be something, some connection. My fingers shook as I flipped through the pages, my mind racing. I turned page after page, my eyes scanning each photograph. And then I found it, the photograph that matched the one I'd just discovered. There he was. Elias Whitaker. His face was barely visible, hidden beneath the same darkness that consumed him in the other photo. And behind him was the house, the same house I was in. The same house from the photograph that had chilled me to the bone. But there was something more. As I stared at the image, I noticed that something in the background seemed to move. A figure, faint but unmistakable. A shadow that stretched unnaturally long, reaching out from behind Elias Whitaker, curling and twisting like a living thing. The air in the attic grew colder, and I felt a sudden rush of panic. The shadows seemed to be closing in on me. I could hear them now, soft whispers, faint at first, but growing louder. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a warning. A plea. I slammed the album shut, my hands trembling. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. The temperature in the attic seemed to drop even further, and I could see my breath clouding in the air. I took a step back, my eyes darting around the room. The shadows were shifting, moving, closing in on me. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. But there was no answer. Only the whispers. only the growing darkness. I needed to get out of there. I needed to leave the attic to escape the house. But my legs felt like lead, my body frozen in place. I turned toward the stairs, but the way down was blocked by shadows. They were everywhere now, thick and choking, swirling in the corners, stretching across the floor. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. I felt the cold hand of fear grip my chest. And then, in the corner of the room, I saw it. A figure, barely human, its form shifting in the shadows. It stepped forward, its face obscured, but its eyes were clear. Cold. Empty. It wasn't Elias Whitaker. It was something else. Something older. And it was coming for me. I couldn't breathe. The air was thick, heavy with something unnatural. The shadows moved around me like living creatures, circling, twisting. I could feel their cold presence pressing in on me, closing the space, suffocating the very air I tried to draw into my lungs. My eyes locked on the figure in the corner. It wasn't Elias Whitaker anymore. No, this was something else entirely. Its shape was distorted, not fully human. It seemed to shimmer in and out of existence, its form constantly shifting, stretching, as though the shadows themselves were giving birth to it. The edges of its body seemed to blur and bend in unnatural ways, like a mirage caught between worlds. I stumbled back, my mind racing. What was this thing? Where had it come from? And why was it here? It didn't move at first. It just stood there, watching me, its dark eyes gleaming with an almost predatory interest. The whispers in the air became louder, and now I could almost make out fragments of words, broken, fragmented, like a language I wasn't supposed to understand. Help, it's here, too late, run. The voices twisted and melded together, overlapping, as though coming from different places all at once. Each word filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread, like a force trying to drag me under. I turned to run. I had to get out of there. My legs were shaking, but I forced them to move, stumbling towards the stairs. The shadows seemed to stretch further, trying to reach me, their cold fingers brushing against my skin. The room itself felt alive, like it was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I reached the stairs and gripped the railing, my heart pounding in my chest. But as I tried to move down, I froze. Something was wrong. The shadows on the steps were growing, spreading across the floor. They weren't just shadows anymore, they had substance, weight. They were no longer simply part of the room, they were alive. My breath caught in my throat as I realized something even worse. The shadows weren't just around me. They were inside me, too. I could feel them pulling at my thoughts, clouding my mind. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I was still in the attic or if I had slipped into some other place, some twisted version of reality. The whispers became clearer now. The voice seemed to come from behind me, closer than before. I spun around, but there was nothing, only the figure, standing there, watching me. But it was no longer still. It was moving now, shifting and stretching, its body elongating unnaturally. I could feel its gaze on me, cold and empty. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. And then, as if to prove that thought wrong, it spoke. It's too late. The voice was deep, guttural, but it was tinged with something that felt almost familiar. It was as if the shadows were speaking not with their own voice, but with something or someone else's. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just the shadows haunting this house. It was them, the ones from the photographs, the ones from my family's past, the ones I had never been told about. I backed away from the figure, my body trembling uncontrollably. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of everything. Elias Whitaker, the house, the whispers, the shadows. Was this some sort of curse? A family secret that had been hidden away for generations? The figure didn't move any closer, but it didn't need to. The shadows around me began to shift, closing in on me from all sides. They were like hands, reaching for me, trying to drag me into the darkness. I could hear the whispers louder now, too loud, too close. I felt the coldness of the air wrapping around me, chilling me to the bone. I couldn't see, couldn't think, couldn't escape. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, and just as I thought I would collapse under the weight of it all, the attic door behind me slammed shut. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the shadows. The figure stepped forward, its shape now almost entirely formed, though it still wasn't fully clear. I could see its face, faintly, but it was distorted, a mask of shadows, its features twisted in a way that was both haunting and unfamiliar. I could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on me, like a physical force trying to crush me. We're not finished yet. I wanted to scream again, to run, to fight, but my body was frozen in place. The figure reached out, its hand, if you could even call it that, stretching toward me. Its fingers were long, twisted, and covered in thick, creeping darkness, like claws made of shadow. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, thumping in time with the rising dread in my chest. I tried to move, tried to break free from the grip of the shadows, but I was trapped. I could feel them crawling up my legs, around my arms, pulling me into their cold embrace. And then, just as I thought I would be consumed by them, I remembered the album. The photographs. Elias Whitaker. The words in the back of the photograph, the shadows never forget. With a surge of desperate clarity, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the photograph I had found earlier. The one with Elias Whitaker's name. The one with the house. I held it in front of me, my hands shaking. The figure stopped. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, stared at the photograph. For a moment, there was stillness. The shadows seemed to hesitate, as though they were waiting. And then, with a scream that tore through my chest, the shadows recoiled, pulling back from me as if burned by the light of the photograph. The figure lurched backward, its form flickering, losing cohesion. I didn't wait to see if it was gone. I turned and ran, the shadows trailing behind me, but for now, they seemed to fear the light, the truth that the photograph represented. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air, the night cold against my skin. The shadows, for the moment, were gone. But I knew this was far from over. The mystery had only deepened. Elias Whitaker, the album, the shadows, none of it made sense yet. And something told me, as I stood there in the dark, that the house was waiting for me to return. It wasn't finished with me. The cold night air felt like a shock to my system as I stood outside the house, my chest heaving with each breath. The house loomed behind me, dark and silent, as though it were waiting for me to come back inside, waiting for me to finish whatever had been set into motion all those years ago. The album, Elias Whitaker, the shadows, they were all connected in a way I couldn't yet understand. But I knew, deep down, that I wasn't free of it. I had escaped the attic, but I hadn't escaped the house. And the shadows weren't done with me. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I couldn't outrun them. Whatever this was, it had to be confronted. The house, the family, the dark things lurking in the past, they were all part of the same story. I had to go back. The next morning, The light seemed wrong. It was too bright, too harsh, casting long shadows across the lawn that stretched farther than they should. The house appeared to be in perfect order, as if nothing had happened, as if I hadn't just had a near-death experience in its attic the night before. But I knew better. The house was still alive. It was watching me, waiting for my next move. I had to search deeper. There had to be more answers hidden in the house, things my grandmother had left behind, things that had been forgotten. And so, with a sense of dread weighing heavily in my chest, I made my way back inside. The interior was just as it had been before, quiet, oppressive, and seemingly unchanged. The living room felt colder than I remembered, as if the walls themselves were thick with a cold, ancient presence. The same dust hung in the air, and the same old furniture sat motionless, frozen in time. But the silence had a new edge to it. It was heavier. It wasn't the silence of a home that had simply been abandoned. It was the silence of a place that was waiting for something to happen. I could feel the weight of it as I moved through the rooms, each step slow, deliberate. I went back to the staircase that led to the attic, but I stopped halfway up, a strange sensation crawling up my spine. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath. The shadows in the corners of the rooms seemed darker, as though they were pressing against the walls, eager to spill out into the open. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching me. The attic door was slightly ajar, and I hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. The room felt suffocating, the air thick and heavy with a presence I couldn't describe. The shadows, too, seemed thicker in the attic, as if they had grown stronger since last night. I stepped forward, my pulse racing, and my eyes immediately landed on the album, sitting there innocently on the table where I had left it. But it was different now. There was something about it that felt off. The album was no longer closed. It was open, its pages turned, as if someone or something had been flipping through it while I was away. I moved closer, my breath shallow. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I felt a strange mixture of fear and curiosity. What was I about to uncover? What had I missed before? I flipped the pages slowly, each one seeming heavier than the last. And then, there it was. A photo I had never seen before. It was a picture of my grandmother, but she looked different in this one. She was younger, much younger, perhaps in her 20s. She was standing with a group of people outside the house, but something was off. There was a strange look in her eyes, a mixture of fear and defiance. The people around her, the faces were blurred, distorted, but there was something in the way they stood, something in the air around them, that felt wrong. My finger hovered over the photo, a chill running down my spine as I studied the details. The shadows in the picture were unusually thick, more solid than they should be, as if they were part of the group. One shadow, in particular, seemed to stretch toward my grandmother, as if it were reaching out to her. My grandmother's expression in the photo sent a wave of unease through me. She knew something. She had known something about the house, the people, the shadows. It was as if she had been aware of a danger that no one else had seen. A secret that had been buried beneath the layers of time. I turned the page to see what came next, but instead of another photograph, I found a letter written in my grandmother's hand. My fingers trembled as I unfolded it, the paper brittle with age. It was addressed to someone named Amelia, a name I didn't recognize. The letter was short, but its contents sent a chill through me. Amelia, you must understand that we are all in danger. The house knows us, and the shadows remember us. They will never let us go. I fear that I am not long for this world, but you must, please, do whatever you can to protect the others. The album, the photographs, they are all connected. If you find the truth, you must burn it. The shadows never forget. They are not just memories. They are a part of us, a part of everything we've done. Do not let them take you, too. The letter ended abruptly, as though it had been cut off in the middle of a thought. I felt my breath catch in my throat. This was it. This was the key. My grandmother had known about the shadows. She had known about the dark things that lurked in the house. And she had tried to warn someone named Amelia, someone who was probably already lost to whatever it was that haunted this place. But the most chilling part of the letter was the final sentence, "Do not let them take you, too." I could hear a sound behind me, faint but unmistakable. The soft, shuffling sound of footsteps. My heart stopped. I wasn't alone. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, still. But the air had shifted. The shadows were deeper now, pressing closer. The whispering began again, low and urgent. It was impossible to make out the words, but I felt them, felt their coldness seep into my bones. The figure from last night was there again. I could feel its presence, even if I couldn't see it. It was in the corners of my vision, just out of reach. Its whispers grew louder, more frantic, and I realized, too late, that it was feeding off my fear. The shadows were closing in, tightening their grip on me. The house had been waiting for me to return. And now, it wouldn't let me leave. The whispers were louder now, surrounding me, crawling into my thoughts like insects. Every part of my body screamed for escape, but my legs wouldn't move. I couldn't run. The shadows had me, pulling me deeper into their grasp with every breath I took. It felt as though the walls themselves were closing in, trapping me in this suffocating space. The figure, once distant and shadowed, was closer now, its presence undeniable, almost tangible. I could feel the chill of it wrapping around me, an icy tendril that curled up my spine. The air seemed to freeze, each breath a struggle as the temperature plummeted. My thoughts were clouded, fogged by fear and the eerie, foreign energy that hung in the room like a shroud. I was still holding the album in my hands, its pages now flickering between images, as if the photographs themselves were alive, reacting to the presence of the figure. The faces in the photos were staring at me, their eyes wide, their expressions frozen in silent terror. I thought I saw them move ever so slightly, but I couldn't be sure if it was my mind playing tricks on me. Then, a voice, so deep, so guttural, that it seemed to come from within the very walls themselves. It wasn't human, not in the way we understood it. It was ancient, the voice of something older than time. You cannot escape it. You cannot escape what has always been. The words echoed in my mind, bouncing around like a drumbeat, shaking my very soul. I tried to speak, tried to answer, but my voice caught in my throat. The shadows were suffocating me, and the room, the house, seemed to be alive with them. I could feel the presence of hundreds, thousands, perhaps more, swirling around me, pushing me towards the brink of madness. The figure didn't speak again, but its form shifted, still not entirely solid, but somehow more present, more real. It was as if it had come into being, materializing from the darkness itself. Its face, if it could be called a face, was shifting, flickering between shadows and human-like features, distorted, grotesque, a reflection of something both familiar and alien. Its eyes were pools of darkness, endless and void, and as it stepped closer, I could see something in those eyes, something terrifyingly familiar. It was as if I knew it. As if it had always been there, hidden just beyond my perception. I staggered backward, my hand clutching the album tightly. The pages fluttered, turning on their own, each photograph seeming to scream at me, telling me the same thing over and over again. It's too late. It's all too late. The shadows, the whispers, they were growing stronger, pressing in until the walls themselves seemed to warp and twist. I felt a pull, an overwhelming tug, as if something inside the house was beckoning me, drawing me toward the darkest part of it. The basement. I hadn't thought about the basement since I had arrived, but now the idea of it clawed at my mind. My grandmother had mentioned it only once, a passing remark about not going down there. But why? What was hidden beneath the house? What had they been hiding all these years? The figure seemed to sense my thoughts, for its presence became more insistent, more threatening. I looked toward the staircase that led to the basement, the shadows gathering there, blocking the way. But the pull was too strong. I knew, deep down, that I had no choice. I turned, without thinking, and began to move toward the basement door. The house trembled as if it were alive, and I could feel the floor beneath me groaning, the walls closing in. I could hear the whispers now, so loud I couldn't distinguish them from my own thoughts. My heart was pounding in my chest, each beat thundering in my ears. I reached the basement door, but as I touched the knob, a sound stopped me cold. A slow, creaking groan. It wasn't the door. It was something else, something far worse. It came from the basement. The sound of something moving in the dark, something not quite human. My stomach twisted into knots. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as the whispers intensified. The shadows seemed to slither across the floor, reaching for my feet, pulling me down. I had to fight them, had to break free. With a strength I didn't know I had, I yanked open the door and rushed down the narrow, creaking stairs into the darkness. The air in the basement was thick with dust and age. I could barely see my hand in front of my face, but I felt the weight of the darkness pressing on me from all sides. The shadows here were different, heavier, darker, as if they were part of the very foundation of the house. They didn't move like normal shadows. They watched. I stumbled forward, my feet sinking into the cold, damp floor. My eyes strained in the dim light, searching for something, anything, that could explain what was happening. And then, I saw it. A small chest, tucked away in the corner, half covered by a thick layer of dust and debris. It was old beyond belief, its surface scratched and worn, as if it had been opened countless times, only to be closed again. I didn't need to think. I knew what I had to do. I approached it slowly, my breath shallow, every instinct screaming for me to stop. But I couldn't. I couldn't leave without knowing the truth. I had to open it. The chest. The key to everything. I knelt down, hands trembling, and pried open the lid. Inside was a stack of old photographs. My grandmother's, Elias Whitaker's, others I didn't recognize. But it wasn't the photos that made my blood run cold. It was the other thing, the object that lay beneath them. A small, ancient-looking book, bound in what seemed like leather, though it was impossibly cold to the touch. I reached for it, my fingers brushing the edges, and I could feel a sudden jolt of energy surge through my body. The shadows in the basement stirred, as if awakened by the touch of the book. I opened it, the pages brittle and yellowed with age. The first page read, "The shadows remember." And that was when I understood. The shadows weren't just memories. They were alive. And they had never forgotten. I heard the footsteps again, closer now, rushing toward me. The figure had followed me into the basement. And now, It was time to face the truth. Have you ever felt something that shouldn't be there? Something that wasn't real, but it was so vivid you could almost touch it? That question had haunted me since the first time I set foot on that train. It wasn't supposed to be anything special. Just another day. Just another ride. But from the moment I stepped onto the platform, I knew something was off. It was the smallest of things at first, nothing obvious, just a flicker of unease in the pit of my stomach. But over time, those little things added up. They always do. I'm Max. I've lived in this city for years. Like everyone else, I've taken this subway hundreds, maybe thousands of times. The trains are packed, the stations crowded with tired commuters, their eyes glazed from the monotony of the daily grind. There's nothing exciting about it. Nothing unusual. That's how it's supposed to be. But not anymore. I don't know when it started exactly. It was one of those things that slowly crept up on you, like a dream you can't fully remember when you wake up, but you know it was strange and unsettling. There were whispers among the passengers, rumors passed from one to the next, carried through the stale air of the underground tunnels. But no one dared speak of them aloud. Everyone just kept to themselves, pretending everything was fine. And maybe it would have been if I hadn't seen it. It was a late evening, the platform dimly lit, the station quieter than usual. Most of the commuters had already boarded their trains, leaving behind a few scattered figures waiting for the next one. I'd been working late again, as usual. I don't have much of a social life, just work and the commute. When the train finally pulled in, I could see the glow of the lights from the windows, the faint reflection of faces pressed against the glass. But when the doors slid open, something felt wrong. There was no sound. No shuffle of feet. No greetings or small talk. It was as if the train had swallowed every sound, leaving only an unnatural silence behind. I hesitated. I should have gotten on. I should have brushed it off as nothing more than a strange coincidence, but I couldn't. There was a presence on that train. Something I couldn't explain. I boarded, my heart beating a little faster than usual. The doors slid shut behind me, sealing me inside. I found a seat, trying to calm my nerves, telling myself it was just the tiredness, the long hours catching up with me. But that feeling, the feeling of being watched, didn't go away. It grew stronger the longer I sat there. And then I heard it. A soft rustling sound, like paper being crumpled in the distance. I looked around, but the train was almost empty. There were a few people scattered throughout the car, but none of them seemed to notice the sound. I tried to tell myself it was just the train's old machinery, the creaks and groans that came with age. But something in me told me it wasn't. It was the smell that hit me next. At first, it was faint, just a whisper of something old and musty, like the air had been trapped in this tunnel for decades. But as the train sped forward, the scent grew stronger, thick and almost suffocating. I looked at the others around me, but no one else seemed to notice. They were all lost in their own thoughts, their eyes glazed over. The train lurched, and for a moment, the lights flickered. The usual hum of the tracks seemed to shift, almost imperceptibly. But I felt it. Something had changed. I glanced out the window, but all I could see was darkness. The tunnel had swallowed the light, leaving only a shadowy blur. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure. It wasn't just any person, it was something else. Tall, too tall. It was standing at the far end of the train, its face hidden in the dark, just beyond the reach of the dim overhead lights. I couldn't make out its features, but I could feel its gaze, cold and heavy, bearing down on me. My heart skipped a beat. I looked away, trying to dismiss it as my imagination running wild. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It grew, sinking deeper into my chest, like fingers closing around my ribs. The train jerked again, this time harder, almost as if it had hit something. I grabbed the seat in front of me to steady myself, and that's when I heard it. A whisper. At first, I thought it was just the air conditioning, a trick of the sound. But no! It was a voice. Low, indistinct, just barely audible over the hum of the train. Get off. It was soft, almost too quiet to be real, but it was there. I turned, scanning the train, my eyes darting over the empty seats and shadowed corners. The figure was gone, but I could still feel its presence, lingering as if it had never left. The next stop came too soon. My heart was racing, my body frozen in place. I needed to get off. I needed to get away from this, whatever it was. But when the train slowed to a stop, the doors didn't open. The hiss of the air brakes was the only sound, deafening in the silence. I tried pressing the button to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The screen above the doors flickered, showing the next station, and then it changed. The words blurred, scrambled, and then disappeared altogether. And then the train started moving again. Faster this time. I gripped the seat in front of me, my mind spiraling. This wasn't right. This wasn't supposed to happen. The train was supposed to stop. It was supposed to take me home. But instead, it plunged deeper into the darkness. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as the whispers returned, louder this time. Get off, get off. The voice was everywhere. And in that moment, I realized something terrible. This wasn't just any subway line. It was a line that didn't exist. I should have panicked. I should have screamed, run to the door, or done anything. But my body froze. It was like I had forgotten how to move, how to react. All I could do was sit there, staring at the flickering lights above me, trying to convince myself that what I was experiencing wasn't real. Maybe it was exhaustion playing tricks on me. Maybe it was all in my head. But the longer the train rumbled through the endless darkness, the more I realized how impossible that explanation was. The voice came again, this time clearer, sharper. A soft, hoarse whisper that seemed to slither in from the very walls of the train, wrapping itself around my mind. Get off, now! I blinked rapidly, my heart pounding, my breath shallow. I looked around, desperate for some sign of normalcy, but everything felt wrong. The walls of the train car were too close, the lights too dim, as if the air itself had thickened, pressing against me. I could hear the faintest hum from the tracks beneath, but it was distorted, like a broken radio station. My gaze snapped to the doors again. They were still shut, locked. But now they looked different. The metal frame, once clean and functional, had a deep, almost imperceptible distortion to it, as if the edges were warped, stretched unnaturally. I could feel my pulse in my throat, the air around me thick with something heavy, suffocating. I leaned forward, trying to calm myself, but the motion made the entire car seem to sway, like the ground beneath me wasn't steady. My vision blurred for a split second, and when it cleared, I saw something that sent a chill deeper than I thought possible. The figure. The same shadow, but now it was closer. It stood at the far end of the car, just beyond the flickering light. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its presence, and it was watching me. My skin crawled at the thought. For a moment, I considered standing up, running to the front of the train, yelling for help. But then the whisper came again, this time right behind me, and it was so clear I could feel the cold breath on my neck. Don't run. I gasped, my body going rigid. It was impossible. No one else was here, right? There were no other passengers. Just me. And the voice. And that figure. I had to do something. Anything. I stood up, my legs shaking. The moment I moved, the air in the car seemed to shift, becoming heavier, like gravity had increased tenfold. The lights flickered again, this time plunging the train into complete darkness for a few seconds. When they came back on, the figure was closer, much closer, now standing only a few feet from me. Its outline was too tall, too thin. Its limbs stretched at unnatural angles, bending in ways they shouldn't have. A deep sense of dread settled over me. I couldn't make out any other details, no face, no clothes, just the outline of a shadowy figure that seemed to absorb the light around it. It was like looking at something that shouldn't exist, and yet, there it was. Right in front of me. I stumbled backward, heart racing, desperate to get away, but there was no escape. The train kept moving, faster now, the hum of the tracks growing louder, a deafening roar that drowned out everything else. Why won't you leave? The voice was louder now, stronger, almost pleading. It sent a shockwave of fear through my chest, freezing me in place. I turned, desperate for any sign of the door opening, but the train seemed to be moving faster, pushing me further into the unknown. The station signs, those digital screens that usually showed the next stop, were now blank. Nothing. Just an endless stretch of darkness, and that ever-present, growing sense of something following me. I could hear footsteps now, too. Faint, distant at first, but then closer. So close. I whipped around, but there was no one behind me. The figure was gone, replaced by more shadows stretching across the walls of the train car. The whispers grew into voices, fragmented, echoing, unintelligible. It was like a chorus of muffled screams, distorted and layered on top of each other, seeping through the walls of the car, closing in on me. I tried to cover my ears, but it didn't help. The voices kept coming, louder, more desperate. Get off. Why are you still here? Leave us. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to escape. I ran to the door again, my hands trembling as I pounded on the metal, trying to pry it open. But the door didn't budge. The train kept moving, faster and faster. I could feel the walls of the car pressing in on me, the air growing colder. The temperature dropped so rapidly, I could see my breath in the air. My mind raced. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. But the train didn't stop. It wouldn't stop. I turned to the windows, desperate to see something, anything. The reflection in the glass was distorted, like a funhouse mirror, but there was something in it. Something behind me. I gasped. It was a face. A twisted, distorted face, barely visible in the glass, its features warped into a grotesque expression. Its eyes were wide and hollow, black voids that seemed to swallow the light. The mouth was open, wide enough to fit the entire length of the train car, dripping with something dark and viscous. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The face in the window stared back at me, grinning, as if it knew exactly how much fear I felt in that moment. And then the train jerked. The screech of metal against metal was deafening, the train lurching as if it had hit something hard. And in that split second, the door opened. The space beyond was black, deeper than any tunnel I'd ever seen, darker than night itself. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I bolted. I ran through the door and into the abyss. But as I crossed the threshold, I felt something grab my ankle. Something cold. Something strong. I looked down, and I saw the hand. I could feel the icy grip tighten around my ankle, dragging me back toward the door. I screamed, my voice breaking, but it felt like the sound was swallowed by the very air around me. My hands clawed at the floor, trying to pull myself forward, but whatever was behind me had a strength far greater than anything I could muster. I kicked, flailing, desperate to break free, but the cold hand didn't release. It was like it had become a part of the train itself, rooted in the darkness, impossibly strong. The further I pulled, the deeper it seemed to sink into the ground. I could feel the train vibrating, the hum of the tracks intensifying, but it was different now, more sinister, as if the entire world was moving in sync with the darkness. The hand, or whatever it was, didn't feel human. It was wrong. It was too long, too thin, its fingers too many, twisting like roots beneath the earth. The skin was pale, sickly, as though it had been buried in dirt for years. It was like something that shouldn't exist. Let go! I cried, the words catching in my throat, but the grip only tightened. I looked back, terrified, knowing that whatever it was, whatever had reached for me, was not just trying to stop me. It wanted to pull me back into the abyss. I had no choice. I had to fight. I slammed my other foot down hard, kicking with every ounce of strength left in me. My foot connected with something soft and unnatural, and I felt the hand loosen slightly. I took that moment. I wrenched myself free, crawling forward, dragging my body away from the door, the coldness of the train's metal floor searing my skin. The air in the car had changed. It was dense now, like I was breathing through thick, suffocating smoke. The whispers were louder again, 1,000 voices, distorted, echoing off the walls. I couldn't make sense of the words anymore, just fragments of sound. It was like a chorus of pleading, of pain. I couldn't look back. I couldn't. But my body wouldn't let me stop. Something inside me told me that if I stopped running, I would be lost forever. So I pressed forward, hands trembling as I scrambled, my pulse pounding in my ears. But it wasn't just the hand that was after me. The darkness outside the train had begun to shift, swirling, moving as if alive. I could see shapes forming in the window reflections, twisted figures pressed up against the glass, their faces contorted into grotesque, mocking expressions. They didn't belong in the train. They didn't belong in the world. But they were there, watching, waiting. And then, suddenly, everything stopped. The train lurched again, but this time it wasn't just a small jerk. It was violent, as if something enormous had collided with the train, sending it veering off track. I lost my balance and fell, slamming into the floor with a harsh thud. For a moment, everything went silent. The lights flickered again, throwing everything into brief darkness before they came back on. The train car was still moving, but the feeling in the air had shifted. It was heavier, colder, as if the train was no longer just moving through tunnels. It was moving through something far worse. I could feel it now, something more than just the eerie atmosphere or the strange figures pressing against the glass. There was something else, a deep, resonating presence that pulsed within the train itself. And then I heard it. A sound. A click. A soft, mechanical click. I turned slowly, my heart hammering, dread filling my chest. The doors. The ones that had been locked before, the ones that had refused to open. They were open now. The abyss beyond them beckoned, a swirling mass of darkness, its depth infinite. It was like a tunnel that stretched beyond the world, its edges frayed and torn, impossibly wide and deep. I could feel it drawing me in, the air around it thick and pulling, like a vacuum pulling at my soul. But it wasn't just the door. No. There, standing in the threshold, was the figure again. The one from before. It had come closer. Much closer. I couldn't breathe. It was taller now, its features more distinct in the dim, flickering light. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, its fingers curled like long, twisted claws. The silhouette was almost human, but the way it moved, it didn't belong. It was an impossible thing, a thing that shouldn't be on this train, shouldn't even exist. Its eyes, if you could even call them eyes, were black holes, sucking in the very light around it. Its mouth opened wide, too wide, a jagged, twisted smile that seemed to stretch across its face, revealing row upon row of needle-thin teeth, gleaming in the dark. I could hear its voice now. It wasn't a whisper anymore, but a low, guttural hum vibrating through the middle of the train. Join us. My body screamed at me to move, to run, but I couldn't. I was frozen in place, my muscles stiff and uncooperative, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. Join us. The voice was louder now, a chorus of voices merging together into one deep, unholy sound. It was like the walls of the train were closing in on me, pressing tight against my chest. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went quiet. The train stopped. Not just the sound, but the movement. The feeling of motion disappeared. I was no longer in the train. I didn't know where I was. The world around me had gone completely still. There was no light, no sound, nothing. Just an all-encompassing silence, the kind that presses in from all sides. And then I heard it. A faint whisper right behind me. Welcome to the line. I could feel the cold creeping through my veins, like 1,000 icy needles pricking at my skin. My mind was a blur, everything felt like a dream, but the fear gnawing at me was real. Too real. I could still hear the whispers, a constant hum in the air, too low to understand, but loud enough to feel like a presence was closing in on me. The words "welcome to the line" echoed in my head, but I couldn't make sense of them. It didn't feel like I was on the train anymore. It felt like I had crossed into something else. Something unnatural. I forced myself to take a step forward. My legs trembled, my breath shallow, as if the air itself was pressing down on my chest. The darkness stretched out in front of me, swallowing everything. I couldn't see the edges of the space, couldn't tell where the walls ended or where the floor even began. It was as if I was floating, weightless, suspended in an infinite void. The air was thick, almost viscous, like breathing through a wet cloth. Each step felt wrong, like the ground beneath me wasn't solid, like it could dissolve into nothing at any moment. My heartbeat was deafening, pounding in my ears. Every muscle screamed for me to run, but I couldn't move. Not yet. I had to know what was happening. I had to find some kind of answer. Suddenly, I heard the sound of movement. It was faint at first, just a soft scraping, like fingernails against metal. But then it grew louder, closer, as if something was crawling toward me in the darkness. I stopped dead in my tracks, heart racing. The sound was unsettling, too erratic, too frantic to be human. I spun around, but there was nothing. Nothing but the black void stretching out before me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I could feel my pulse quicken. It wasn't just the sound of scraping anymore, it was breathing. Heavy, uneven breaths coming from somewhere behind me, too close. Hello? My voice cracked as I spoke, sounding smaller than I felt. There was no answer, just the unending hum of the whispers, now mixed with the sound of those breaths, growing louder, heavier, like something or someone was getting closer. I turned back to face the darkness in front of me. The whispering was growing more distinct now, the words clearer, though still unintelligible. They sounded like they were calling my name. No, not my name. Something else. I could almost make it out, a pattern in the noise. And then, there it was. A flicker of light. At first, it was so faint, I thought I was imagining it, but then it grew, slowly expanding, until it became a thin, jagged line of light. It was coming from a doorway. At least, I thought it was a doorway. It was hard to tell in the darkness, but the light was enough to guide me. I didn't hesitate this time. I moved toward it, my legs still shaky, but the need to get out of this place was stronger than any fear. The whispering seemed to grow louder, more frantic, as I neared the light. My breath was ragged, my mind a storm of questions, of doubts, of terror. What was this place? Where was I? And why was everything so wrong? I reached the doorway, and when I stepped through it, I felt a sudden weight on my chest, like something was pressing against me, making it hard to breathe. The air smelled stale, damp, like a forgotten place. The walls around me were jagged, as if they had been carved from stone, their edges rough and uneven. It wasn't the train anymore. It couldn't be. The space around me was too vast, too cavernous. There were no windows, no doors, just endless, crumbling walls and twisted, broken shapes. The shadows seemed to move on their own, flickering and shifting in the corner of my vision, as though something was lurking just out of sight. And then I heard it again. The scraping sound. Closer now. It wasn't just crawling anymore, it was walking. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, dragging across the ground like something large and sluggish was moving toward me. The whispers, too, had changed. They weren't just murmurs now, they were more like growls, deep, guttural sounds that reverberated in my chest. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but I could feel it, something was there. Something was coming. I backed away, my hands trembling as I reached for the walls, trying to steady myself. I was no longer sure of my own footing. Everything felt unstable, shifting beneath me. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't. I had to keep moving. The sound of the footsteps grew louder. And then I saw it. A shadow in the dark, a tall, twisted figure, its outline blurred and indistinct, but the way it moved was unmistakable. It was slow, deliberate, dragging its feet like it was searching for something. Or someone. The figure stopped, its head tilting as though it could sense my presence. And then it turned toward me. My breath caught in my throat. My body froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was trapped in place, staring at this thing, this creature, as it slowly moved toward me. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a horrible, low growl that sent a jolt of fear through my spine. The growl seemed to come from all around me, like it was coming from the walls themselves. The figure was almost upon me now, its face still hidden in the shadows. Its movements were unnatural, too smooth, too fluid, as if it was part of the darkness itself. And then, just as it reached out for me, I felt a searing pain in my chest. I gasped, stumbling back, but the pain intensified, spreading like fire through my body. I reached for my chest, but there was nothing there, nothing visible. But the pain was real. I could feel it. I could feel it inside me, as though something was tearing through me, pulling me apart. And then the growl came again. Louder this time. It was a sound I would never forget. It wasn't just a growl anymore, it was a voice. A voice, deep and raspy, whispering a single word. Stay. The world around me was fading, slowly twisting into a dark blur. My chest burned, the searing pain pulsing with every ragged breath I took. The creature's voice still echoed in my mind, stay. It wasn't a command. It was a warning. But a warning for what? What was waiting for me in this darkness? I stumbled backward, feeling the weight of the air pressing down on me. My knees buckled, but I forced myself to stand. The creature's form lingered, moving closer, but its shape remained vague and indistinct. It was like it didn't belong to this world, like it was part of the shadows themselves, a thing that could bend the very laws of nature. My pulse was a drumbeat in my ears, drowning out everything else. The whispering had returned, but now it wasn't just a low hum. It was an overwhelming roar, so many voices, overlapping and twisting together in a cacophony of disjointed words. Some were familiar, like the sound of distant conversations. Others were guttural, distorted, like animalistic growls that scraped against my nerves. I had to move. I had to get away from it. The thought pierced through my panic like a single thread of clarity. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't wait to find out what it wanted. My legs shook, but I pushed myself forward, blindly stumbling through the suffocating darkness. Every step felt wrong. The ground underfoot didn't seem solid. It felt soft, spongy, like I was walking on something alive. Something breathing. I couldn't focus on it for too long. The sound of the creature moving behind me, its feet dragging, scraping the ground like metal claws on stone, was enough to keep me moving. I barely registered the sharp scent of damp earth filling the air, mixing with something rancid and sickly. It made my stomach churn, but there was no time to think about it. No time to breathe. A sudden flash of light caught my attention. A distant glow, flickering, weak, like a dying ember. It was barely visible in the blackness, but it was enough to give me direction. I lunged toward it, my hands outstretched, fingers trembling as I reached for the light, desperate for something real. The whispers grew louder again, more frantic, but the growl of the creature faded into the background. The closer I got to the light, the more it seemed to shift, moving further away with every step I took. It was like the light didn't want me to reach it. It was taunting me, pulling me in, only to pull away at the last moment. I felt the walls closing in. The tunnel was narrowing, squeezing in on me, the ceiling lowering, the air growing heavier. I could feel the weight of it all pressing down on my chest, pushing the breath out of me. I couldn't see anything ahead of me, but I could feel something watching. Something close. I wasn't alone anymore. I never had been. Just as my hand reached out to grab the light, everything stopped. The growling ceased. The whispering vanished. For a brief moment, there was nothing but silence. I stood there, frozen, trying to process what had just happened. Had the creature gone? Was it just toying with me? Or was it waiting for me to make the next move? I didn't have much time to think. The light flickered again, stronger this time, and I rushed toward it, every muscle in my body screaming for me to escape. The air was heavy with anticipation, as though something terrible was about to happen, something I couldn't avoid. I could hear the echoes of my footsteps bouncing off the walls, but there was no growl anymore. No presence. I felt my fingers brush the cold metal of what seemed to be a door. A door? I wasn't sure what it was, but it was the only thing that had appeared in the darkness. The only thing that felt solid. I pushed against it. The door creaked, and then with a sudden force, it swung open, revealing a tunnel, just another stretch of subway tracks, but this one looked different. The walls were lined with faded, peeling tiles, and the lights above buzzed weakly, casting a dull yellow glow. The smell of mildew hung heavy in the air. But there was no sign of the creature. No sign of the growling presence. I hesitated, but only for a moment. I didn't want to go deeper, but there was no other way. No other option. If I didn't move now, I didn't know what would happen. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the tunnel. The moment I crossed the threshold, I felt the shift. The atmosphere changed. The temperature dropped. It was like stepping into a different world, one where time no longer seemed to follow the same rules. The walls pressed in on me, narrowing with every step I took. The floor beneath me was cracked, pieces of it missing, leading deep holes that led into a void of blackness. The tracks were rusty, the steel warped and bent as though they had been here for decades. But it wasn't just the physical space that felt wrong. It was the silence. The whispers had stopped completely. The growling had ceased. And yet, something was worse. Something felt more threatening than before, more insidious. I heard my name again. This time, it wasn't a whisper. It wasn't a growl. It was clear, too clear. The voice echoed through the tunnel, and it felt like it was coming from everywhere, all around me. Come closer. I froze. The voice was so close now, I could feel it vibrating through my chest. It was familiar, but not in the way I expected. It wasn't a voice I recognized from anyone I knew. It was mine. But it wasn't. It sounded like the voice I might have had if I had been someone else. A darker version of me. One who had never left the subway. One who had never escaped. I wanted to turn around. I wanted to run. But my feet wouldn't move. The air was thick, almost choking, and as the voice continued to call, I felt my resolve slipping away. The darkness pressed in from all sides, and the shadows began to shift again, like they were watching me, waiting. I closed my eyes, but the darkness only got deeper. The voice got louder. Stay. And then, the ground gave way beneath me. Everything was falling. And I was falling with it. It was a quiet evening when the phone rang. The kind of evening where the world seemed to settle into a peaceful hum, the city outside wrapped in the usual buzz of late-night traffic. I had been sipping my coffee, staring absent-mindedly out of the window, when the shrill sound broke the silence. An unknown number. I had a rule. Never answer calls from numbers I didn't recognize. But for some reason, I picked up. Hello? There was a long pause on the other end, just static. Then, a voice, deep and distorted, as if coming from a distance, a voice that seemed to come from somewhere not quite real. Do you hear it? The line clicked dead before I could respond. My heart skipped. I checked my phone, no missed calls, no records of the strange number that had just called. A chill crawled up my spine. What did it mean? What did the voice mean? Do you hear it? I tried to dismiss it. Just a prank, I thought. Maybe a wrong number. But there was something about that voice, something off, something that lingered in the air long after the call had ended. I stood up, pacing my small apartment, trying to shake off the unease. My phone was silent. Too silent. I couldn't help but glance at it from time to time, expecting it to ring again. It didn't. The next morning, I tried to forget about it. Life moved on, but I kept feeling watched. A constant unease settled in. It was subtle at first, just a glance out of the corner of my eye, a shadow passing too quickly across the hallway, but as the day wore on, it grew worse. I worked in a small office, a nondescript building tucked between two larger skyscrapers. The typical gray of office life, mundane and predictable. My colleagues were all the same, busy with their screens, glued to their desks. But today, something was different. The air was thick with a strange energy, like something was about to happen, but I couldn't tell what. The sound of the office phone ringing snapped me out of my thoughts. I looked up from my computer screen, my eyes instinctively scanning the room. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw a figure at the far corner of the office, tall, shadowed, unmoving. My eyes blinked, and it was gone. I shook my head, focusing on the ringing phone again. I wasn't sure if I'd just imagined it, but the unease wouldn't leave. I picked up the receiver. Hello? Silence. Then the voice, again, just as distorted, just as unnerving. Do you hear it? I felt my stomach drop. I couldn't breathe. The line went dead again, but I didn't hang up. I couldn't. My fingers clenched around the receiver, my mind racing. I stood there for a long time, trying to process what was happening. Someone was playing with me. But why? And how did they know about the call from last night? It was only then that I noticed something on the desk, just a small piece of paper, neatly folded. I hadn't seen it there before. It wasn't mine. I slowly unfolded it, my hands trembling. There, in hastily scrawled handwriting, were just 2 words. The bell. I froze. I had heard the rumors, the stories passed around by whispers, of a bell that could summon something dark, something otherworldly. It was an old myth, one that most dismissed as nothing more than superstition. But something in the pit of my stomach told me this was real. I didn't know what was happening. My mind raced, my thoughts jumbled. Was someone playing a prank on me? Was I losing my grip on reality? Or was there something more to this? But the strange occurrences didn't stop. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. Everywhere I went, I felt the weight of unseen eyes. The ringing calls. The voice. And then, the bell. It started in the middle of the night. A sound. Soft at first, almost imperceptible, like a distant echo. I tried to ignore it, burying my head in the pillow, but the sound grew louder, more distinct. The unmistakable toll of a bell, deep and resonant. It vibrated through the walls, sending a shiver through my bones. I jumped out of bed, my heart racing. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. But it was. The bell was there, somewhere in the city. Somewhere close. I could feel it. It was like the sound was in my very veins, pulsing, calling. I rushed to my window, peering out into the street below. The city was quiet. No one else seemed to hear it. I grabbed my coat and rushed out, following the sound. I don't know why I did it. Some part of me wanted to know what was happening. But the other part of me, something more primal, was terrified of what I might find. I walked through the empty streets, the sound of the bell growing louder with every step. It felt like I was walking in a dream, a nightmare. The city seemed different, distorted, like it was slipping out of place, warping. Then, I saw it. At the end of the street, standing alone under the dim light of a street lamp, was an old, ornate bell. It was out of place, too old, too out of time. The kind of bell you'd expect to find in some forgotten cathedral, not on a quiet street corner. It stood there, unmoving, as if it had always been there, waiting for me. I couldn't breathe. My hand shook as I stepped closer, drawn to it, unable to stop myself. The bell rang again, and the sound felt like it was shaking the very air around me. And then I saw something else. A figure in the shadows, watching. I wasn't alone. I froze, my heart racing as the shadowed figure moved slightly, almost imperceptibly. At first, I thought it was just the darkness playing tricks on my eyes, but the figure stepped forward, its outline sharp against the dim light from the street lamp. I couldn't make out its features, but I could feel its presence. It was like a weight in the air, pressing down on me. I took a step back, my feet frozen to the cold pavement, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The figure was tall, thin, too thin, and the darkness seemed to cling to it, almost as if it was part of it. A chill ran down my spine. The bell tolled again, and the sound seemed to reverberate deeper, as if it was coming from inside my chest. My fingers twitched, but I couldn't bring myself to reach for my phone. What would I say? Someone's out there? Who would believe me? The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring. At least, I thought it was staring. I couldn't see its eyes, only the vague shape of its face, pale and featureless. It wasn't human, or at least not in any way I could understand. I wanted to scream, to run, to escape, but my legs refused to cooperate. Another step. Then it spoke. A low, guttural sound that didn't quite reach my ears, more like a vibration I could feel in my bones. I couldn't understand the words. It was like the language itself was unfamiliar, ancient, unsettling. My mind couldn't process what it was saying, but my body felt the words as though they were marking me, branding me in some unspoken way. Do you hear it? It whispered, the voice as distorted as the one on the phone. I felt my pulse race. The question, again. Why did it keep asking that? I blinked, and when I opened my eyes, the figure was closer. Too close. Too fast. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. The air around me felt thick, stifling, as though the city itself was closing in. The figure's shadow stretched longer, twisting unnaturally under the streetlight, growing and warping as though it didn't belong in the physical world. Who are you? I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper, barely a sound against the weight of the night. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it tilted its head, as if considering me. Its face was blank, featureless, like a mannequin's head, smooth and empty. But there was something in its movements, a subtle shift in the way it moved, that sent a wave of nausea through me. I had to get away. Without thinking, I turned and ran. The bell tolled again, louder now, as if it was following me, pressing down on me. I could hear the faintest sound of footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate. I glanced over my shoulder. The figure was there, still standing under the lamplight, but now there was something else. A shadow, just out of reach, something shifting in the darkness behind it. I couldn't make out what it was, but I could feel it. It was watching me. I broke into a full sprint, my heart pounding, my breath ragged in the cold night air. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay here. Not with that thing, whatever it was, following me. The streetlights flickered as I ran, casting long, twisting shadows that seemed to mock me. I turned a corner, gasping for breath. My legs were burning, my mind racing. I didn't know if it was just fear or if something truly unnatural was chasing me. But one thing was clear, something was wrong. Something I didn't understand. I darted into an alley, hoping to lose whatever it was behind me. I pressed my back against the cold brick wall, trying to catch my breath, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my phone. But when I looked at the screen, there was no signal. Nothing. I glanced down the alley, half expecting to see that figure emerge from the shadows, but there was nothing. The air was still. Too still. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That thing, whatever it was close. I could feel it. It was here. I turned, ready to bolt, but then I saw something. On the ground, lying in the middle of the alley, was a small, ornate bell. Just like the one I had seen earlier, standing in the street. It gleamed under the faint light, a strange, unnatural shine that seemed to draw me in. I knelt down slowly, my fingers brushing against it. The moment I touched the bell, a surge of energy coursed through me, a shock that rattled me to the core. The world around me seemed to shift, to bend. The alley distorted, the walls stretching and warping. The sound of the bell grew louder in my ears, echoing, vibrating through the air like a force I couldn't escape. And then I heard it. A voice. Deep, cold, and unrecognizable, whispering right in my ear. Do you hear it? It was the same voice. The same distorted tone. But now, it was no longer just a question. It was a command. The bell tolled again, and the world around me collapsed into darkness. I don't know how long I was out. My body felt heavy, like I was submerged in water, unable to move, unable to breathe. When I opened my eyes, everything was distorted, warped. The alley I had been in was gone, replaced by a cold, empty void. A thick fog swirled around me, so dense that I couldn't see past the end of my own hands. The air was thick, suffocating, and I could taste the metallic sharpness of fear in my mouth. I tried to stand, but my legs buckled beneath me. I felt nauseous, disoriented, as though my body was no longer my own. The faint ringing of the bell still echoed in my ears, louder now, a deep, resonating tone that seemed to reverberate through every part of me. The fog seemed to move around me, as though it had a life of its own, swirling and shifting in unnatural patterns. It was as though the very air itself was alive, pulsating with something ancient, something unknowable. I reached out, my hands trembling, but there was nothing. No solid ground, no familiar object to hold on to. Just the endless, suffocating fog. And then I heard it. A voice. Do you hear it? It was the same voice from the phone call, from the figure in the street. The words were colder now, more distant, as if they came from somewhere far beyond the void. I whipped my head around, searching for the source, but there was nothing. Just the thick fog. Who are you?" My voice cracked as I shouted into the emptiness. There was no response, no sign of movement. Only the sound of the bell tolling again, each chime cutting through the fog like a blade. I couldn't breathe. I tried to take a step forward, but my feet sank into the ground as though the very earth was pulling me down. I struggled, panic rising in my chest. My mind screamed for me to run, to escape, but there was no way out. No way to fight whatever this was. The bell tolled again, louder this time, and the fog around me seemed to twist, forming shapes, faint, shadowy figures that flickered in and out of existence. I squinted through the haze, my heart pounding. I had to get out of here. I pushed forward, fighting the heavy pull of the ground beneath me. The figures in the fog moved closer, their forms becoming clearer, more distinct. There were 5 of them, tall and thin, like the one I had seen before. But there was something different about them now. They weren't just shadows anymore. They were alive. They moved, their bodies bending and twisting in unnatural ways, like they didn't belong in this world. One of them stepped forward, its face still hidden in the darkness, but its eyes, there was something about its eyes. Black, empty holes that seemed to swallow the very light. I froze. "Do you hear it?" The voice was closer now, right behind me. I could feel the breath on the back of my neck, cold and suffocating. I spun around, my fists clenched, ready to fight, but the figure was gone. Instead, the fog seemed to part, revealing a narrow path that stretched into the distance. The bell rang again, the sound seeming to come from somewhere far ahead. I had no choice. I started walking, my legs heavy, as though I was walking through thick mud. The air was thick with the oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional toll of the bell. With each step, the fog around me seemed to grow darker, the shadows lengthening, pulling closer. The figures followed me, their movements fluid and unnatural, like they were part of the mist itself. I could hear them whispering, but I couldn't make out the words. The sound was more like a buzzing, a hum that filled my ears and rattled my teeth. I kept walking, unable to stop, unable to understand what was happening. The path in front of me seemed endless, twisting and turning, but no matter how far I walked, the bell rang louder, closer, always just out of reach. The figures behind me were closer now, their twisted forms moving faster, their shadows stretching to envelop me. I started to run. My breath was ragged, my chest tight with fear. But the path never ended. No matter how fast I ran, the fog was endless, the tolling of the bell never stopped. And then, suddenly, the fog cleared. I stopped dead in my tracks. Before me stood an ancient door. It was made of dark wood, carved with intricate symbols that seemed to pulse with a faint, otherworldly light. The door was ajar, just slightly, as though it was waiting for me. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The bell tolled again, and this time it was deafening. It felt as though the very ground beneath me was shaking. I reached out to touch the door, my fingers trembling, but the moment I made contact, a surge of energy shot through me like an electric shock that rattled my bones. And then I heard the voice again, louder than ever, its tone dark and commanding. "Come through. Do you hear it?" I felt my heart stop. I didn't know what was behind that door, but I knew I had to go through. The figures were closing in, their hollow eyes watching me, waiting for me to make the choice. The bell tolled one last time, a deafening sound that seemed to pierce the very fabric of reality. With one final breath, I pushed open the door and stepped through. The door closed behind me with a heavy, resonating thud, like the final note of a funeral bell. My body froze. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The air here was thick, stale, and clung to my skin like a blanket of oppressive heat. The world around me was darker than before, the shadows seeming to stretch into infinity. I blinked, trying to adjust my eyes to the dim light, but it felt as though the very air was pushing me down. I was no longer standing on a path or in some misty, fog-cloaked alley. I was in a room. The walls were made of smooth stone, cold to the touch. The floor beneath me was made of old, worn tiles that seemed to have been cracked and broken over centuries of neglect. The only source of light came from the faint glow that pulsed around me, barely enough to make out the intricate symbols carved into the walls. They shifted, almost imperceptibly, as if they were alive, watching me. A low hum vibrated through the air, emanating from the walls themselves, vibrating in my chest. It was the bell, I realized. The sound had followed me through the door, sinking into the very fabric of this place. I took a hesitant step forward. My footsteps echoed, far too loud for the silence around me. It felt as though every movement was being watched, studied. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness. The temperature dropped with each breath, and I could see my breath fogging in the air before me. And then I heard it again. Do you hear it? The voice wasn't as distant this time. It was close, too close, as though it were coming from the shadows themselves. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing. Just the darkness stretching into the corners of the room. I started to walk, every step cautious, as though I was afraid to disturb something ancient, something asleep. The walls seemed to close in as I moved deeper into the room. I glanced over my shoulder, feeling eyes on my back, but no matter how fast I turned, I saw nothing but shadows. The floor shifted beneath me. It was subtle, like a change in the wind, but I felt it. The tiles beneath my feet had begun to move. They creaked and groaned under my weight, sliding into place with quiet, sinister precision. I didn't dare look down for fear that I might see something emerging from the cracks in the tiles. I had to find a way out. The hum grew louder, vibrating through my teeth, my skull, filling every corner of my mind. It was as though the room itself was alive. The light pulsed in time with the sound, beating like a heart, each thrum stronger than the last. The symbols on the walls began to shift in rhythm with the bell, spinning, swirling in hypnotic patterns, their edges blurring as though they were melting. Do you hear it? The voice repeated, the words now dripping with a cold malice. Come closer. I didn't want to. I didn't want to move closer, but my feet seemed to betray me. They moved forward on their own, drawn to the source of that voice like a moth to a flame. The shadows around me deepened, stretching toward the center of the room. The walls seemed to pulse, the symbols twisting in on themselves, forming new, terrifying shapes. Faces, eyes, hands, things that shouldn't have been there, emerged from the walls, flickering in and out of existence like ghostly apparitions. The bell rang once more. Louder, stronger, an unholy resonance that seemed to rattle the very core of reality. The floor buckled beneath my feet, and I stumbled forward, bracing myself against the wall for support. The shadows around me stretched and contorted, becoming figures, moving, whispering my name. I jerked my head around, breath coming in ragged gasps. Who are you? My voice cracked, barely above a whisper, but the words still managed to cut through the air. What do you want from me? The bell tolled again, the sound shaking the room. The walls seemed to bend inward, the floor rising, warping. The figures around me were no longer just shadows, they were faces. Eyes. and they were staring at me, watching me. Then, one of the figures moved. Slowly, as if dragging itself across the floor, it came toward me. Its form was faint at first, a flickering silhouette that seemed to shift with each step. But as it came closer, it solidified. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, thin limbs that stretched unnaturally. Its face, if it could even be called a face, was a smooth, featureless void, but I could feel it looking at me, watching me, studying me. Its body rippled and shifted, as though it were made of smoke or shadows that were not quite solid. I backed up, stumbling over my feet. My breath came faster, panic setting in. No! Stay away! I screamed, but my voice felt weak, swallowed by the oppressive air around me. The figure didn't stop. It moved closer, its long, spindly fingers reaching out toward me. I could feel the cold, clammy presence of it. My skin crawled, every nerve screaming for me to run, but my legs were frozen in place, like they no longer belonged to me. The bell tolled once more, louder than ever, the sound vibrating in my bones. The figure's hand reached out, and just as it brushed my skin, everything stopped. The room went silent. The shadows disappeared, and the figure vanished into the ether, leaving only the faintest trace of its presence. The hum in the air died down. The oppressive coldness receded. I stood there, panting, hands trembling at my sides, unsure if I was still alive or if I had somehow slipped into a world that wasn't my own. Then I heard the voice again, softer now, almost a whisper. Do you hear it? I turned, heart hammering in my chest. The door was gone. I was alone. And the bell? It was still ringing. I had no idea how much time had passed since the door disappeared or since the shadow figure touched me. Time didn't seem to exist in this place, at least, not in any way I could understand. The room I was in had warped further since that last encounter. The walls had cracked, exposing a dark, void-like space behind them. The faint light that had pulsed earlier now flickered sporadically, casting sharp shadows that danced, twisting like live creatures. Every step I took felt heavier, as if I was walking through thick mud or something more sinister, like the very air was trying to trap me here. I kept thinking about the voice, the question, do you hear it? It kept echoing in my head, making it impossible to focus. But there was no denying it. I did hear it. The bell was still ringing, distant yet near, a sound that made the back of my neck prickle. It was like the world itself was being torn apart, piece by piece, with each toll. I needed to leave. I pushed forward, my mind racing. The shadows in the room had become more aggressive, lunging toward me in sharp, jagged motions. I could hear them whispering now, faint voices overlapping, like dozens of people talking all at once. Their words were indistinct, but the tone was clear, urgent, pleading, desperate. But what were they saying? Who were they? I pressed my hands against the stone walls, feeling the vibrations beneath my fingers. The hum was becoming more intense, more erratic. It felt like my heart was sinking to it, as though my pulse was matching the rhythmic toll of the bell. Each beat of the bell seemed to shudder through my body, rattling my thoughts, leaving me disoriented. A chill swept through the room, and for the first time, I felt a presence behind me. Not the strange, faceless shadow I had seen before, but something else, a feeling. I wasn't alone. I turned, my breath caught in my throat, but there was nothing. At least, nothing I could see. I was losing my grip on reality. Do you hear it? The voice whispered again, closer now, almost in my ear. I whipped around, my pulse racing, but there was still no one there. Nothing but the endless shadows and the fractured stone. The air was thickening. The darkness was creeping closer, coiling around me like smoke, trying to suffocate me. And the bell, it was louder, overwhelming. I had to do something. I had to find out what was causing it, where it was coming from. There had to be something, anything, that could stop it. I stumbled forward, desperate now. I couldn't tell if the walls were shifting on their own or if my vision was warping, but they felt closer. The air was so heavy it was suffocating. The floor was slick underfoot, and I could hear the faintest sound of something scuttling just out of reach, a scraping noise against the tiles, like claws against stone. The bell tolled once more. Each vibration of the sound resonated inside me. I fell to my knees, my hands pressed to my ears, trying to block it out. But it was impossible. The sound was inside me, around me, everywhere. Do you hear it? The voice was no longer a whisper. It was a scream, a maddening scream that tore through my thoughts. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't escape the sound. My mind was unraveling, each toll of the bell pulling me further into a darkness I couldn't comprehend. I stood up shakily, stumbling toward what looked like a doorway, or perhaps an exit. Whatever it was, I had to reach it. I didn't care if it led to the same place or nowhere at all. I had to get away from the sound, from the presence that was closing in on me. The door was just ahead, but as I reached for the handle, something changed. The bell rang once more, but this time, the sound didn't just echo through the room. It exploded, a deafening crash that shook the very air, sending tremors through my body, rattling my bones. The world around me distorted, the walls groaning in protest, and for a moment, everything went black. When I opened my eyes again, I wasn't in the room anymore. The bell had stopped ringing. The silence was suffocating, and I found myself standing in a completely different place. The room I had been in was gone. The shadows, the walls, the oppressive weight of it all, they were replaced by an empty, white space. No windows. No doors. No sign of the world I had just left. I was alone. For a second, I thought I had gone insane, that this was it. I had finally lost myself to the bell's toll. But as I stood there, trying to steady my breathing, I saw something in the distance. A figure. At first, it was just a silhouette, indistinct, but then, the light shifted, and I saw it more clearly. It was me. A mirror image of me, standing exactly where I had been. But it was wrong. The figure in the distance wasn't just a reflection. It was different. Its eyes were hollow. Its mouth stretched into a smile that was far too wide. Too knowing. And as I watched, it began to move, slowly walking toward me. "Do you hear it?" the voice asked again. But this time, it was my voice. It was a sound I couldn't ignore. It was so quiet, so subtle, yet it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. A soft, deliberate knock, like someone had all the time in the world to wait. The door was old, the kind that groaned and rattled with every gust of wind, but this felt different. I stood frozen in the living room, not sure if it was real. It was almost as if the air around me had thickened, muffling all the other sounds. The old clock on the wall ticked steadily, but its rhythm seemed suddenly jarring, like it had started ticking too loudly. I glanced at the window, but the street outside was empty, just the faint glow of the streetlights casting long shadows across the sidewalk. I wasn't expecting anyone. The house had been quiet for days. I hesitated for a moment, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind. Maybe I was imagining things. But the knock came again. Softer this time, almost like a whisper, but it was there, undeniable. I walked slowly toward the door, my heartbeat growing faster with each step. The house felt colder now, or maybe I was just imagining that too. I reached for the doorknob, and as my fingers brushed against the warm brass, a chill ran through me. I turned the handle and opened the door, just a crack. There was no one there. My mind raced. I looked down the empty street once more. Nothing. But then, something caught my eye. A figure stood at the far end of the driveway, just out of the reach of the porch light. His face was partially obscured by shadows, but I could see enough to make out his worn clothes and the strange way he stood there, as if waiting for me to do something. I hesitated, unsure of whether to step out or close the door. But before I could make up my mind, he spoke. "I've been looking for you." His voice was low, raspy, like someone who hadn't spoken in a long time. The words were unsettling, but it wasn't the words themselves that unnerved me, it was the way he said them. There was a strange certainty in his voice, like he knew something I didn't. My instinct screamed at me to shut the door and lock it, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. "Who are you?" I finally managed to ask, my voice shaky. The man didn't answer at first. He just stood there, his eyes fixed on mine, dark and unreadable. There was something about him that seemed out of place. The longer I looked, the more I felt like something was wrong. "I'm someone from your past," he replied after what felt like an eternity. My stomach twisted. I hadn't heard a voice like that in years. My past? I tried to remember, but nothing came to mind. The man didn't seem familiar. And yet, something about him made the back of my mind itch with memories I couldn't quite grasp. He took a step forward. "I know you don't recognize me," he said, "but I remember you." A sense of unease settled deep within me, something darker than just fear. This wasn't a coincidence. I could feel it. I stepped back instinctively, but the man didn't move any closer. He seemed to be waiting for me to make a decision. "Do you want to hear what I have to say?" he asked, his voice softer now, but with an undercurrent of something almost pleading. "I need you to understand. It's important." His words hung in the air, suspended between us. The house, once so familiar, suddenly felt foreign. The walls seemed to close in, and the silence around me became suffocating. My mind raced. Should I invite him in? What did he know? Why was he here? I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. I didn't know what to say, and I didn't know what I was supposed to feel. Part of me wanted to slam the door shut, to pretend this was just some strange dream, but another part, an unsettling part, wanted to know more. The man seemed to sense my hesitation, and with a slow, deliberate movement, he stepped closer to the porch. There was no sudden rush, no frantic desperation in his steps. Just a calm certainty that unsettled me even more. "I know what happened," he continued. "I know what you tried to forget." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold night air. Those words, they hit something deep inside me, like a buried memory I wasn't ready to confront. "What do you mean?" My voice was barely a whisper, almost a plea for him to elaborate. But instead of answering, the man turned away, glancing over his shoulder as if checking for something. His eyes locked with mine one last time, and there was something cold, something knowing, in his gaze. "You're not safe here," he said, his voice barely audible now, like the wind had stolen his words. And with that, he turned and disappeared into the night, fading into the shadows like a ghost. I stood in the doorway, the night air suddenly heavy, as if the very world around me had shifted. The knock, the figure, the words, it was all too much. I stepped back inside, closing the door behind me, and locked it. But even as I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the house anymore. The knock had been just the beginning. The night felt heavier now, as if the air itself had thickened and was pressing in on me. I didn't know what to think, what to believe. The man's words echoed in my mind, reverberating like the thudding of a distant drum. I know what you tried to forget. I paced the living room, running my fingers through my hair. The house felt different. I could hear every creak of the wooden floorboards beneath my feet, every rustle of the curtains in the corner of the room. It was as though the house was alive, its silence now oppressive instead of comforting. I hadn't wanted to open the door. I should have known better than to answer it. But his presence, his voice, had gripped me in ways I couldn't explain. There had been something unnervingly familiar in his words, something that felt like a warning, and yet I couldn't bring myself to act on it. I glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt cold and unfamiliar. I sat down in the armchair by the window, the same chair I'd sat in countless times before. I stared out into the darkness, but my mind was far from calm. There was a small knot of unease in the pit of my stomach, twisting tighter with every passing second. The knock, the figure in the driveway, his cryptic words, they had all set something off inside me, but I couldn't figure out what. Why had he come? Who was he, really? A part of me wanted to dismiss it all as some strange encounter, a random man who had been wandering the streets and picked my house at random. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The way he had spoken, so certain, so deliberate, it felt as if he had been expecting me. As if he knew me, or at least knew something about me I had long since buried. I tried to focus on something else, anything else. But my thoughts kept drifting back to the man's words. I walked into the kitchen, my mind still racing, and flicked on the light. The soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the room. But then, as I poured myself a glass of water, I heard it. A soft tapping sound. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. It came again, tap, 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 and this time I could tell it wasn't the pipes or the house settling. It was coming from somewhere close, somewhere near. I held my breath, straining to hear it. The sound was faint but distinct. I set the glass down, my fingers trembling slightly. Could it be him? Could he be back? I moved toward the door that led out to the hallway. The knocking had stopped, but the air felt colder now, like something was watching me. I opened the door slowly, my eyes scanning the hallway in the dim light of the kitchen. Nothing. Just the same quiet, empty hallway I had walked down countless times before. The silence was suffocating. The house felt like a cage now, its walls closing on me. I shook my head, trying to shake the feeling. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. The knock earlier, the strange man outside, it was all too much. I was just tired. But then I heard it again. A soft scraping noise. This time, it was coming from upstairs. The floorboards creaked under the weight of something moving. It was so subtle, yet unmistakable. My skin prickled. My instinct screamed at me to leave the house, to run, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. I grabbed my phone from the counter and dialed the number of my closest friend, Emma. I needed someone to talk to make sense of this madness. The phone rang once, twice, and then it picked up. Hello? Emma's voice was groggy, clearly just waking up. Emma, I need you to come over. Please, I said, my voice tight with urgency. I think there's someone in the house. There was a pause on the other end of the line. What? Are you serious? Are you sure? Emma sounded confused, but I could hear the concern in her voice. I don't know. I don't know what's going on, I replied, my words coming out in a rush. There was a man earlier. He knocked on the door. He said he knew me, and now I keep hearing things. I'm not imagining it, Emma. I swear. Another pause. I'm coming over. Don't go anywhere, she said firmly. I ended the call and put the phone down on the counter. I stood there for a moment, the silence of the house pressing on me. The noise from upstairs had stopped, but the feeling of being watched had only intensified. I couldn't explain it. It was like something had shifted in the very fabric of this house, and I wasn't sure if I could trust my own senses anymore. Minutes felt like hours. I could hear every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside, every breath I took. Finally, there was a knock on the door. A sharp, loud knock. I froze. This time, it wasn't a subtle tap, a soft whisper. It was aggressive, forceful. I didn't even have time to move before the doorbell rang. I hadn't invited Emma in yet. Was it her? Or was it him? The figure from earlier? I couldn't bring myself to open the door immediately. I stepped cautiously toward the door, peeking through the peephole. What I saw made my stomach turn. There was no one there. I opened the door. Nothing. Just the empty porch, the faint flickering of the streetlight. But then I saw it. A small, crumpled piece of paper on the ground, caught in the wind. I bent down to pick it up. On the paper, written in a hasty, almost frantic script, were 3 words. He's coming back. I stood there, holding the crumpled paper in my hand, the words burning into my mind. He's coming back. The message seemed so simple, so cryptic, and yet it carried an unbearable weight. I turned it over in my hands, half expecting to find something more, some clue, some explanation. But there was nothing else. Just the same rushed handwriting, as if the person who wrote it had been on the edge of panic. I felt the floor beneath me shift, my breath quickening, as though the room itself was closing in. The air seemed thicker now, the shadows creeping along the walls, stretching and contorting into shapes that didn't belong. I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched, that the very walls of my house were closing in, conspiring against me. I glanced around nervously. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the windows and howling through the cracks of the door. The night felt alive with a quiet tension, as if something was waiting just beyond the threshold. I couldn't tell if it was the house itself making me feel this way, or if something far more sinister was creeping into my life. I needed answers. But the more I thought about it, the less I understood. Who was this person who had left the message? Was it the same man who had knocked on my door earlier? The thought made my pulse race. My mind was spinning, trying to piece together the puzzle, but every answer seemed to raise more questions. I stepped back inside, carefully shutting the door behind me, the cold air lingering on my skin. I glanced at the hallway, half expecting to see someone waiting there. But the house was empty. Silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I moved to the living room and sat down on the couch, the crumpled notes still clutched tightly in my hand. I tried to focus, tried to make sense of everything that had happened. The man who had appeared at my doorstep, his cryptic message about knowing things I had tried to forget, had he known about the incident? The thing that had haunted me for years? I couldn't avoid it any longer. I had to confront it. The memories flooded back, unbidden, crashing over me like a wave. It had been nearly 5 years since that night, the night everything had changed. The night I lost everything. The details were still painfully vivid, etched into my mind as if they had happened only yesterday. It had started so simply, a normal evening. I had been out with friends, enjoying an ordinary night in a busy, crowded city. But it wasn't the noise or the commotion of the night that had stayed with me. No, it was the feeling of something wrong, of something dark just beneath the surface. I couldn't put my finger on it then, but now I knew it had been there, lurking, waiting for the right moment. And then came the phone call. The phone had rung just after midnight. I remember the way my hand trembled as I picked it up, how the voice on the other end had been strained, panicked. My friend, Emma, had been screaming. The words she had said still echoed in my mind, impossible to forget. Something's in the house. I don't know what it is. It's not real. Her voice had broken, cutting through the night like a knife. When I got there, it was too late. The house had been empty. But the blood, there had been blood everywhere. On the walls. On the floors. Everywhere. I had never seen anything like it in my life. And I had never been able to make sense of it. No one believed me when I tried to explain. The police said it was a robbery gone wrong, that it was all just a freak accident. But I knew that wasn't the case. I could still feel the cold air, the sense of dread even now, as I sat in my living room trying to make sense of everything. What had happened that night? What had Emma seen? And what had the man meant by, I know what you tried to forget? I rubbed my eyes, trying to clear the fog of confusion that clouded my thoughts. It had been years since I had even considered that night, and now it felt like the past was bleeding into the present, threatening to swallow me whole. I stood up and paced around the room. I had to do something. I had to find out who this man was, what he knew, and why he was suddenly back in my life after all this time. I grabbed my phone and tried calling Emma again. My fingers fumbled with the screen as I dialed, but the call went straight to voicemail. My stomach twisted with worry. Something wasn't right. I tried again. And again. No answer. I set the phone down and grabbed my jacket, pulling it out as I headed for the door. If Emma wasn't answering, I had to go find her. The house felt oppressive, the air growing thicker with each passing second. The shadows outside seemed to stretch longer, more menacing. I stepped into the hallway, and that's when I heard it. A faint sound. Almost like a whisper, but too low to make out the words. I froze. It came again. A whisper, so soft that it was almost imperceptible. I stepped forward, my heart pounding, my breath shallow. "Help me," the voice said, just loud enough for me to hear. I spun around, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I backed away from the door. Something was wrong. Very wrong. The voice had been real, too real. It wasn't just a figment of my imagination. I was certain of it. I hurried back to the living room, my pulse racing. I didn't know what to do, where to go. The walls of the house felt like they were closing in around me, as though something was waiting, watching. And then I remembered the note. He's coming back. The words now felt like a prophecy, one that I couldn't escape from. I had to know who this man was, and what he wanted. But as I reached for the door again, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A knock. It was at the door. But this time, I didn't hesitate. This time, I was ready. The knock came again, louder this time, like an urgent summons. It echoed through the house, reverberating in my chest as I stood frozen in place. The house, once so familiar, now felt alien, as though it had transformed into a cage, trapping me within its walls. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The weight of the moment was pressing down on me, making it hard to think clearly. What did he want? What was this all about? I took a deep breath, my fingers gripping the edge of the doorframe. My heart pounded so loudly in my ears that it almost drowned out the sound of the wind outside. The knocking persisted, and with each strike, my mind spiraled further into panic. Was it the same man? The stranger from before? Or had someone changed since I last saw him? I stepped forward slowly, cautiously, as if afraid to make too much noise. The wooden floor creaked under my weight, but the knock ceased abruptly, as if the visitor had sensed my movement. For a long moment, the house fell silent again. The only sound was my shallow breathing. I approached the door, each step feeling heavier than the last. The handle was cold under my touch, and I hesitated before turning it. What if it wasn't just the man? What if it was something else, something worse? The thought made my stomach tighten. But there was no turning back. I had to face whatever was waiting on the other side. I opened the door. At first, I saw nothing but the empty, shadowed porch, illuminated only by the dim glow of a street lamp. The cold night air washed over me, carrying the scent of damp earth and something unfamiliar, something metallic. I stood there for a moment, my eyes scanning the darkness. My breath hung in the air in thick clouds, the chill of the night sinking into my bones. The quiet was almost too perfect, too still, like the calm before a storm. I felt the weight of something unseen pressing in, as if the world was holding its breath. Then, I heard it. A soft sound, barely audible at first, like the shuffle of feet. And then, a figure stepped out from the shadows, emerging as if summoned by the darkness itself. The man. He was tall, almost impossibly so, his frame cloaked in a long coat that seemed to absorb the light around him. His face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, casting his features into darkness. His posture was unnaturally rigid, his movements precise, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. I couldn't see his eyes, but I could feel them drilling into me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. He didn't speak at first. He didn't need to. His presence was enough to send a wave of dread crashing over me, filling the space between us with an invisible pressure. The silence stretched on, suffocating. My mind raced, trying to grasp what I should do next. Should I shut the door? Should I run? Should I scream for help? But my legs felt like lead, and I stood there, rooted to the spot. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice low, calm, almost too calm. I knew you'd come. I was hoping you would. His words hung in the air like a promise or a threat, I couldn't tell which. The man took a slow step forward, and I instinctively stepped back, my hand gripping the doorframe harder. The chill in the air seemed to intensify as he drew nearer, his figure looming larger in the dim light. I could feel the temperature drop, as though the world itself was reacting to his presence. "Who are you?" My voice trembled, and I hated how weak I sounded. "What do you want from me?" The man didn't answer immediately. He just stood there, studying me as if I were an insect beneath a magnifying glass. The pause stretched on too long, making the moment feel endless. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as though every secret I had been hiding, every fear I had buried, was being laid bare before him. "Isn't it obvious?" he said, his voice a murmur. "I'm here to remind you of what you've forgotten." The words hit me like a physical blow, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. My mind raced back to that night, the night everything had changed. The blood. Emma. The fear. The feeling that something, someone, was watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake. "He's coming back." The words now felt like a prophecy, one that I couldn't escape from. I had to know who this man was, and what he wanted. But as I reached for the door again, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A knock. It was at the door. But this time, I didn't hesitate. This time, I was ready. The knock came again, louder this time, like an urgent summons. It echoed through the house, reverberating in my chest as I stood frozen in place. The house, once so familiar, now felt alien, as though it had transformed into a cage, trapping me within its walls. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The weight of the moment was pressing down on me, making it hard to think clearly. What did he want? What was this all about? I took a deep breath, my fingers gripping the edge of the doorframe. My heart pounded so loudly in my ears that it almost drowned out the sound of the wind outside. The knocking persisted, and with each strike, my mind spiraled further into panic. Was it the same man? The stranger from before? Or had someone, changed since I last saw him? I stepped forward slowly, cautiously, as if afraid to make too much noise. The wooden floor creaked under my weight, but the knock ceased abruptly, as if the visitor had sensed my movement. For a long moment, the house fell silent again. The only sound was my shallow breathing. I approached the door, each step feeling heavier than the last. The handle was cold under my touch, and I hesitated before turning it. What if it wasn't just a man? What if it was something else, something worse? The thought made my stomach tighten. But there was no turning back. I had to face whatever was waiting on the other side. I opened the door. At first, I saw nothing but the empty, shadowed porch, illuminated only by the dim glow of a street lamp. The cold night air washed over me, carrying the scent of damp earth and something unfamiliar, something metallic. I stood there for a moment, my eyes scanning the darkness. My breath hung in the air in thick clouds, the chill of the night sinking into my bones. The quiet was almost too perfect, too still, like the calm before a storm. I felt the weight of something unseen pressing in, as if the world was holding its breath. Then, I heard it. A soft sound, barely audible at first, like the shuffle of feet. And then, a figure stepped out from the shadows, emerging as if summoned by the darkness itself. The man. He was tall, almost impossibly so, his frame cloaked in a long coat that seemed to absorb the light around him. His face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, casting his features into darkness. His posture was unnaturally rigid, his movements precise, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. I couldn't see his eyes, but I could feel them, drilling into me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. He didn't speak at first. He didn't need to. His presence was enough to send a wave of dread crashing over me, filling the space between us with an invisible pressure. The silence stretched on, suffocating. My mind raced, trying to grasp what I should do next. Should I shut the door? Should I run? Should I scream for help? But my legs felt like lead, and I stood there, rooted to the spot. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice low, calm, almost too calm. I knew you'd come. I was hoping you would. His words hung in the air like a promise or a threat, I couldn't tell which. The man took a slow step forward, and I instinctively stepped back, my hand gripping the doorframe harder. The chill in the air seemed to intensify as he drew nearer, his figure looming larger in the dim light. I could feel the temperature drop, as though the world itself was reacting to his presence. Who are you? My voice trembled, and I hated how weak I sounded. What do you want from me? The man didn't answer immediately. He just stood there, studying me as if I were an insect beneath a magnifying glass. The pause stretched on too long, making the moment feel endless. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as though every secret I had been hiding, every fear I had buried, was being laid bare before him. Isn't it obvious? He said, his voice a murmur. I'm here to remind you of what you've forgotten. The words hit me like a physical blow, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. My mind raced back to that night, the night everything had changed. The blood. Emma. The fear. The feeling that something, someone, was watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake. I had tried so hard to bury it all. Tried to move on, to pretend that the past didn't matter, that it was just a bad dream I could wake up from. But now, this man, the stranger, was standing in front of me, unraveling everything I had spent years trying to forget. Who are you? I repeated, my voice barely more than a whisper. What do you know? He took another step forward, and I felt the weight of his presence pressing in around me. His breath was cold, his words colder. I know everything, he said. I know what you did. I know what you saw. And now, I know what you're hiding. My pulse quickened as the world seemed to shift, as though the ground beneath my feet had given way. The walls of the house, once so familiar, now seemed to be closing in, growing tighter, smaller, as though the house itself was becoming part of this nightmare. Stop. I tried to sound firm, but my voice cracked, betraying me. You don't know anything. You don't know what happened. But even as I said the words, I knew they weren't true. He knew something I wasn't ready to face. Something I had been running from, hiding from, for so long. And the worst part was, I knew he wasn't lying. The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering my words. Then he took a step closer, his voice dropping to a barely audible whisper. I can make it all go away, he said. But you have to trust me. I shivered, the cold from outside seeping into my bones. I felt trapped, cornered. There was no escape. The shadows around us seemed to stretch further, pulling me in. I glanced at the door, at the streetlight outside, at the dark figure standing before me. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But something in me, something dark and primal, told me that if I did, it would be worse. So I stayed. I stood frozen, unable to move, as the man's cold gaze seemed to burrow deep into my very soul. The offer he presented, an escape, a way to make everything vanish, to make the nightmare disappear, sounded almost too good to be true. But that was the problem. There was something about him, about the way he spoke, that sent a deep, gnawing sense of unease through me. His words hung in the air like smoke, curling and twisting with promises I didn't understand. "I can make it all go away," he repeated, his voice low and insistent, as if daring me to accept. "All you have to do is trust me." The silence between us stretched thin, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. My mind was a whirlwind, thoughts crashing into one another like waves against jagged rocks. Trust him? How could I trust someone who appeared out of nowhere, someone who knew things about me, about that night, that no one else could possibly know? I took a slow step backward, the door still in my grasp, but I couldn't bring myself to close it. My legs felt like they were made of lead, my body frozen in place by the weight of his presence, by the overwhelming fear that seemed to radiate off him. "You don't need to be afraid," the man said, as though reading my thoughts. His voice was smooth, calm, too calm, in fact. It was almost comforting, like a lullaby sung in the dark. "You've been running for so long, haven't you? Running from the truth. From the guilt." My chest tightened as those words struck home, sinking into me like a blade. I had been running. For years. Ever since that night, when everything had fallen apart, when Emma had, when the blood had. I could still hear her screams echoing in my mind, and I couldn't make them stop. "No," I whispered, shaking my head as if I could deny it. "I'm not running. I've moved on." But the lie felt hollow, even as it left my lips. The man took another step forward, and for the first time, I saw his eyes. They were dark, almost too dark, and they seemed to pull in the light around them, swallowing it whole. I couldn't look away. I felt like I was falling into them, drowning in the darkness. It was like nothing I had ever seen before, like he wasn't even human, like he belonged to a different world altogether. "You haven't moved on," he said softly. "Not really. The truth is still there, buried deep inside you. And I can help you bring it to the surface." I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. His words were like poison, slowly seeping into my mind, twisting my thoughts. What did he want from me? What did he mean by bringing the truth to the surface? I glanced around the room, desperate for some sign, some way to escape this moment, this nightmare. But the walls felt like they were closing in on me, the shadows pressing in from all sides. The house was silent, but the weight of the air around me was thick with anticipation, with something I couldn't quite name. "You're not real," I said, barely more than a whisper. "None of this is real." The man didn't answer. He just stood there, waiting, watching me with those eyes, those empty, black eyes, as though he could see every part of me, every crack in my psyche. My hands trembled as I gripped the doorframe harder. I felt like I was about to snap, like I was about to lose control completely. "Don't fight it," he said, his voice gentle, coaxing. "I can take all this away. The fear, the guilt, the pain. Just let go." I had tried so hard to bury it all. Tried to move on, to pretend that the past didn't matter, that it was just a bad dream I could wake up from. But now, this man, the stranger, was standing in front of me, unraveling everything I had spent years trying to forget. "Who are you?" I repeated, my voice barely more than a whisper. "What do you know?" He took another step forward, and I felt the weight of his presence pressing in around me. His breath was cold, his words colder. "I know everything," he said. "I know what you did. I know what you saw. And now, I know what you're hiding." My pulse quickened as the world seemed to shift, as though the ground beneath my feet had given way. The walls of the house, once so familiar, now seemed to be closing in, growing tighter, smaller, as though the house itself was becoming part of this nightmare. Stop. I tried to sound firm, but my voice cracked, betraying me. You don't know anything. You don't know what happened. But even as I said the words, I knew they weren't true. He knew something I wasn't ready to face. Something I had been running from, hiding from, for so long. And the worst part was, I knew he wasn't lying. The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering my words. Then he took a step closer, his voice dropping to a barely audible whisper. I can make it all go away, he said. But you have to trust me. I shivered, the cold from outside seeping into my bones. I felt trapped, cornered. There was no escape. The shadows around us seemed to stretch further, pulling me in. I glanced at the door, at the streetlight outside, at the dark figure standing before me. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But something in me, something dark and primal, told me that if I did, it would be worse. So I stayed. I stood frozen, unable to move, as the man's cold gaze seemed to burrow deep into my very soul. The offer he presented, an escape, a way to make everything vanish, to make the nightmare disappear, sounded almost too good to be true. But that was the problem. There was something about him, about the way he spoke, that sent a deep, gnawing sense of unease through me. His words hung in the air like smoke, curling and twisting with promises I didn't understand. I can make it all go away, he repeated, his voice low and insistent, as if daring me to accept. All you have to do is trust me. The silence between us stretched thin, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. My mind was a whirlwind, thoughts crashing into one another like waves against jagged rocks. Trust him? How could I trust someone who appeared out of nowhere, someone who knew things about me, about that night, that no one else could possibly know? I took a slow step backward, the door still in my grasp, but I couldn't bring myself to close it. My legs felt like they were made of lead, my body frozen in place by the weight of his presence, by the overwhelming fear that seemed to radiate off him. You don't need to be afraid, the man said, as though reading my thoughts. His voice was smooth, calm, too calm, in fact. It was almost comforting, like a lullaby sung in the dark. You've been running for so long, haven't you? Running from the truth. From the guilt. My chest tightened as those words struck home, sinking into me like a blade. I had been running. For years. Ever since that night, when everything had fallen apart, when Emma had, when the blood had. I could still hear her screams echoing in my mind, and I couldn't make them stop. No, I whispered, shaking my head as if I could deny it. I'm not running. I've moved on. But the lie felt hollow, even as it left my lips. The man took another step forward, and for the first time, I saw his eyes. They were dark, almost too dark, and they seemed to pull in the light around them, swallowing it whole. I couldn't look away. I felt like I was falling into them, drowning in the darkness. It was like nothing I had ever seen before, like he wasn't even human, like he belonged to a different world altogether. You haven't moved on, he said softly. Not really. The truth is still there, buried deep inside you. And I can help you bring it to the surface. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. His words were like poison, slowly seeping into my mind, twisting my thoughts. What did he want from me? What did he mean by bringing the truth to the surface? I glanced around the room, desperate for some sign, some way to escape this moment, this nightmare. But the walls felt like they were closing on me, the shadows pressing in from all sides. The house was silent, but the weight of the air around me was thick with anticipation, with something I couldn't quite name. "You're not real," I said, barely more than a whisper. "None of this is real." The man didn't answer. He just stood there, waiting, watching me with those eyes, those empty, black eyes, as though he could see every part of me, every crack in my psyche. My hands trembled as I gripped the doorframe harder. I felt like I was about to snap, like I was about to lose control completely. "Don't fight it," he said, his voice gentle, coaxing. "I can take all this away. The fear, the guilt, the pain. Just let go. Let go." The words echoed in my mind, resonating with a part of me that I had buried for so long. I thought of the night everything had changed. The blood, Emma's terrified face, the way everything had spiraled out of control. And then, like a jolt of electricity, something else crashed into my mind. Something darker. A memory I hadn't allowed myself to remember for years. The whisper. The soft, faint whisper that had followed me that night. That had stayed with me long after the police had left and the house had been cleaned. "Help me," it had said, just barely audible. And no matter how many times I told myself it had been nothing, just the wind, just my imagination, I knew, deep down, that it had been real. That something, or someone, had been there with me. The man stepped closer, his presence suffocating. I could feel his breath now, cold against my skin. The space between us was shrinking, and with every step he took, my sense of reality seemed to crumble just a little more. "I know you hear it," he said, his voice almost a purr. "I know you still hear her. You think you can forget, but you can't. You know that, don't you?" I felt my knees begin to shake, my mind spiraling further into confusion. His words were like a drug, dulling my senses, making everything blur together. And then, he reached out, his hand hovering just inches from my face. "You don't have to do this alone," he whispered. "I can help you. Just trust me. And all of this will disappear." His fingers brushed against my cheek, cold as ice, sending a shiver down my spine. I wanted to pull away, to scream, to run. But I couldn't move. I couldn't break free from the grip he had on me. "Just one choice," he said. "One simple choice, and it all ends. The truth will come to light, and you will finally be free. You don't have to carry this anymore." I stared at him, torn between fear and a strange, unexplainable pull to believe him. What if it really could end? What if this was the answer I had been searching for, the way to rid myself of the haunting memories, the guilt? But a voice deep within me screamed that this was wrong, that I was being tricked, manipulated. That this man, this creature, was not the solution, but the cause of all the darkness. I took a shaky step back, breaking the trance, but his hand shot out, grabbing my wrist in a grip that felt like iron. "Don't run," he said, his voice sharp, suddenly urgent. "You've been running long enough." I fought against him, panic flooding my veins. My heart hammered in my chest. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. But the cold, unrelenting pressure of his hand was enough to make me doubt everything I had ever known. I had to make a choice. And it had to be now. It's said that some places hold onto their secrets, their tragedies, as tightly as the earth holds its soil. But how do you explain the strange pull of a place that seems to know your name, a place that calls to you even when you don't want to listen? I've heard the stories all my life, whispered by the wind, carried on the breath of the old men who gather at the tavern by the shore. They speak of the lake like it's alive, like it breathes and waits. I never believed them. Not really. Until now. My name is Tom, and I'm a fisherman. Been at it for as long as I can remember. My hands are calloused, my eyes are tired, but I know this lake better than I know my own skin. I've pulled fish from its depths and watched the sun set over its still surface more times than I can count. But lately something's been different. It started with the small things, at first. Strange noises at night, scratching sounds, like something tapping against the hull of my boat. I thought it was just the wind, or maybe the branches from the trees hanging over the water. But then came the dreams. I'd wake up with my heart pounding, drenched in sweat, like I hadn't slept at all. The same dream every time. The lake, dark and endless, its surface churning, bubbling as if something was trying to break free. A shadow in the water. It called to me. At first, I brushed it off. Dreams are just that, dreams. But they kept coming. Each night, the voice from the water grew clearer, more insistent. And each morning, I found myself more drawn to the shore, more compelled to fish, to be closer to that black water. The locals say that those who venture too deep into the lake's heart never come back. Some say it's cursed, haunted by the souls of those who drown there, lost to the water's unforgiving depths. Others speak of a creature, a thing that dwells beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. But it's all just talk, right? That's what I used to think. The first time I noticed the change was on a quiet morning, just as the fog began to lift. I was alone, as usual, drifting slowly in my boat, casting my line into the placid water. There wasn't a ripple in sight. The lake was like glass, perfect and still. But then I felt it. A pressure, subtle at first, like a weight settling on my chest. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone or something standing on the shore. But there was no one. No movement. Just the mist clinging to the trees like a shroud. Then I heard it. A soft rustling sound. At first, I thought it was the wind moving through the reeds, but it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. I turned around, my hand instinctively gripping the oars. And that's when I saw it. A shadow, just beneath the surface of the water. It moved in a slow, deliberate arc, as though something large was swimming below me. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't sure what I was seeing. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the trees, but it didn't feel like that. The air felt thicker, like something was wrong. I told myself it was nothing. Just my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew I wasn't alone. The lake has always been quiet, almost eerie, but now it felt different, alive, in a way that unsettled me. And that voice in my dreams? I could hear it again, faint but clear in the back of my mind. Come closer, it seemed to whisper. Come see what's waiting. I rowed back to the shore faster than I should have, but the unease stayed with me, lingering like a fog that I couldn't shake. When I stepped out of the boat, I couldn't help but glance back at the water. The surface was smooth again, as though nothing had happened. But I knew it wasn't over. Something was changing. The days that followed felt heavier. I tried to push away the unease, but it clung to me like the damp air that hung over the lake at dawn. Every time I looked at the water, it seemed to draw me in deeper, like it was beckoning me to uncover whatever it was hiding beneath. I couldn't stop thinking about the shadow I'd seen, the rhythmic movement just below the surface. But when I asked around, no one else had seen anything unusual. It wasn't until a week later that I felt the change in my body. At first, it was subtle. A slight ache in my back after a long day of fishing. A tightening in my chest when I spent too much time out on the lake. I thought it was just exhaustion, the result of too many long hours spent out in the cold wind. But soon, it became more than that. One morning, I woke up feeling different. Weak. Disoriented. My muscles felt sore, and when I looked in the mirror, my eyes seemed darker, sunken, as if I hadn't slept in days. The strange part? I hadn't felt tired the night before. In fact, I had slept soundly, almost too soundly, as if I had been in a deep, unbroken slumber for hours. I shook it off, but as the day went on, it only got worse. My mind kept drifting back to the lake, to the whispers in the back of my head. That afternoon, I couldn't resist any longer. The pull was too strong, the curiosity too much to ignore. I grabbed my gear and set out on the boat, the familiar weight of the oars in my hands doing little to soothe the gnawing feeling deep in my stomach. The mist was thicker than usual that day. It curled around the boat, clinging to the water, swallowing everything in its path. As I rowed deeper into the lake, I felt the air grow colder, the world around me growing quieter. It was as if the fog had wrapped the entire lake in a shroud, isolating me from everything else. My boat crept forward through the fog, each stroke of the oars more labored than the last. And then, I heard it again. A rustling sound. Not from the trees this time, but from the water. Low and rhythmic, just like before. I froze, my heart thundering in my chest. The shadow had returned, this time much closer, circling beneath the surface of the water. I leaned over the side of the boat, my breath shallow, straining to see through the fog. But all I could make out were ripples, small at first, then growing larger, as if something enormous was moving just below. My mind raced, my heart pounding. The thing I had thought was a trick of the light was real. And it was getting closer. I heard a sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, a low growl, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. I jerked back, my hands shaking as I gripped the oars. What was it? What was in the water? The surface began to shift more violently, like the lake itself was alive, stirring with an unnatural force. I could feel it in my chest, a pressure building, suffocating me. I wasn't sure if it was the fog or the lake itself, but the air around me felt thick, oppressive. Then, I saw it. A shape emerged from beneath the water, slow and deliberate. A dark mass, massive and impossible, its outline barely visible through the fog. The water around it seemed to churn, as if the creature was stirring up the very depths of the lake itself. I couldn't look away. My body refused to move, as if I were trapped in some kind of trance. The shadow twisted and slithered, its edges shifting in and out of focus. The growl grew louder, echoing in the stillness of the fog. Get away, I thought, just row back to the shore. But my hands couldn't find the strength to lift the oars. My body was frozen, my mind at war with itself. And then I heard a voice. It was barely a whisper, but I felt it seep into my bones, into my very soul. The voice, old and weathered, seemed to come from the water itself. Come closer, come see what's waiting. I shook my head violently, trying to break free of whatever hold it had over me. But it was no use. The voice was too strong, too hypnotic. It promised answers, but I wasn't sure if I wanted to know. I finally snapped out of it, my instincts kicking in as panic surged through me. I reached for the oars with trembling hands, trying to row back, trying to escape. But the water was fighting me, pulling me toward the center of the lake, where the thing waited in the fog. The mist seemed to close in around me, thickening with every stroke. The lake, once calm and familiar, now felt like an endless void, suffocating and cold. And then, as if the very fog had swallowed it up, the shadow disappeared. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, unable to move, staring at the empty water. My heart was still racing, my chest tight with fear, and I couldn't bring myself to look behind me. I didn't want to see what was waiting. The rest of the journey back to shore was a blur. My mind was too fogged, too consumed by the fear and the strange voice that had haunted me. But when I finally pulled the boat onto the shore, when I stepped onto solid ground again, I realized something. The feeling, the pressure in my chest, had only gotten worse. The lake had marked me, and I didn't know if I would ever be the same again. The night after that strange encounter was worse than I could have imagined. The moment I stepped off the boat and onto the shore, a sense of dread settled over me like a heavy weight. The trees, the water, the air, it all felt wrong. The fog lingered around the edges of the lake as if it were waiting for something, watching me. I couldn't sleep. The voice that had whispered from the water echoed in my mind, growing louder with every passing minute. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, an entity that had somehow planted itself in my thoughts. The growl, the strange words, they repeated over and over in my head like a broken record. Come closer, come see what's waiting. The worst part? The more I tried to ignore it, the more it intensified. It wasn't just the lake that haunted me now. It was the things I had seen, or thought I'd seen, beneath the surface, the shadow that had moved with unnatural purpose, the ripple in the water that hadn't made sense until now. The lake wasn't just cursed, it was alive. That night, I lay wide awake in my cabin, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds outside. The wind moaned through the trees, and every now and then, I heard something moving just beyond the window, something that didn't quite sound like the wind. The sound of something dragging itself across the ground. But every time I peered out into the night, nothing was there. But I knew something was watching me. The next morning, the fog seemed to cling to everything. It was thick, so thick that I could barely see more than a few feet ahead of me. But I had no choice. I needed answers. I needed to know what the lake was hiding. I grabbed my gear and made my way down to the water. I had barely set foot on the dock when I noticed something strange. The boat was rocking slightly, as if someone had been in it recently, though I had left it tied up to the shore the night before. I felt a chill race down my spine. The air seemed heavier today, thicker with that same oppressive feeling I had experienced the day before. The lake, silent and still, seemed to be waiting for me. The surface was unnaturally calm, but I knew better than to think that meant safety. I had learned that much. The mist rolled in thicker as I rode farther into the lake, swallowing the world around me. But this time, something felt different. The fog wasn't just a physical presence, it seemed to be alive, moving with intent. It pressed against my skin, wrapped around me, suffocated me. I wasn't alone anymore. As I rode deeper, I felt it again, the low, rhythmic hum beneath the water. At first, it was distant, but it quickly grew closer, more pronounced. It was the same sound I had heard the day before, only now it was louder, stronger, as if the lake itself was responding to my presence. I paused, gripping the oars tightly. I could feel my heart racing again, my breath coming in short gasps. The mist swirled around me, twisting, and for a moment, I thought I saw something shift beneath the surface of the water. A shape. A figure. It was moving, following me. No, not following me. Waiting for me. Before I could react, the mist parted, and there it was. The shadow. Larger now. Closer. It loomed beneath the water, its form shifting and undulating with a purpose that sent a jolt of terror through my veins. The surface rippled violently as the creature below stirred. The growl I had heard before returned, this time more distinct, more defined. The sound was unmistakable, coming from the depths of the lake, resonating in my chest. I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. The shadow rose higher, emerging from the depths, revealing something I couldn't quite understand. It was like nothing I had ever seen. Not a fish. Not a creature of this world. The shape, if it could even be called that, was a twisting, writhing mass of darkness. It seemed to flicker and shift, changing form with every passing second, but there was one thing I was certain of: it was massive, far larger than any living thing that should exist in the waters of a small lake like this. And it was coming for me. I felt it before I saw it, a coldness, like a sudden drop in temperature, as if the lake itself had frozen over. The water began to churn, rising up, as though the shadow was pulling itself closer to the surface with terrifying intent. The boat rocked violently, and I could see the dark mass moving beneath the water, a form that didn't belong. I didn't have time to think. Panic surged through me as I grabbed the oars and began rowing frantically. The lake had come alive, and it wasn't letting me go. The ripples around me turned into waves, slapping against the boat, and I heard the sound of something heavy shifting in the depths. I didn't dare look back. The water splashed wildly, as if something was just beneath the surface, moving too fast for me to catch a glimpse. But I could feel it, like the pulse of something ancient, something that had been waiting for years, maybe centuries, to reveal itself. As I fought against the pull of the water, something inside me screamed to get back to the shore, to escape whatever had awoken in the lake. But I wasn't sure if I could make it. The creature below seemed to be toying with me, pulling at the boat, pushing me farther into the center of the lake. I didn't know how long I had been rowing. Time felt like it had slowed down, and the fog closed in tighter with every desperate stroke. I could feel it, whatever it was, closing in, watching me, its presence suffocating the very air around me. Finally, as if some invisible force had decided I had been tested enough, the waves calmed. The lake became eerily still once more. The shadow vanished beneath the water, leaving nothing but the mist in its wake. I looked around, my hands still shaking, my chest heaving. What had just happened? Had I imagined it all? But I knew the lake was cursed. And it was waiting for something, or someone. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The water had gone still, almost unnaturally so. For a moment, I convinced myself that it had all been a trick of the mind, the fog playing tricks, the silence turning into an oppressive force. But deep down, I knew better. I knew I had seen, or thought I had seen, was no illusion. I had barely made it back to shore when I heard the distant cry. A shrill, unnatural sound that echoed across the lake. It wasn't a bird. It wasn't the wind. I knew it was coming from the same place I had been just moments before, the center of the lake. The same place where the shadow had risen. I was too afraid to return to the water. Yet, something inside me compelled me to know more. I couldn't just walk away. Not now. I had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The boat was waiting for me at the dock, the morning sun reflecting off the calm surface. There was no sign of the dark mass beneath the water, no indication of the horror that had nearly dragged me under. But I felt its presence, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for me to return. I had spent the rest of the day trying to put it all together, trying to make sense of what had happened. My mind kept circling back to the legends, the stories people whispered about the lake. How the waters had once been a sacred place, home to an ancient, vengeful spirit. A spirit that had been trapped beneath the surface, bound by the very lake it called home. But something had changed. The lake was waking up, and it wanted something from me. I didn't know why it was calling me or what it wanted, but I had to find out. I had to uncover the truth of this place before it swallowed me whole. That evening, I sought out the only person who might know more about the lake, Old Man Fitzgerald, a local fisherman who had lived in the area his entire life. He was known for his tall tales and superstitions, but there was always a kernel of truth buried in his ramblings. If anyone knew what was really happening here, it was him. I found him sitting on his porch, rocking back and forth, his withered face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. His eyes were squinted, as though he were studying something in the distance, something only he could see. "You've been out there, haven't you?" His voice was raspy, hoarse from years of smoking. "The lake. It calls to you, doesn't it?" I nodded, not trusting my voice to speak the words that had been haunting me all day. "You should have stayed away," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "No good comes from messing with that place. The curse is real. It's been here for generations." I took a step closer. "What curse?" Fitzgerald didn't look at me, but his hands gripped the rocking chair tightly. The lake wasn't always like this. It wasn't always cursed. It used to be beautiful. People would come from all over to fish, to swim, to relax. But then something happened. A long time ago. The spirit of the lake, they say, was angered. The water started to turn dark, the fish began to disappear, and the people, well, they started disappearing too. "Disappearing?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "What do you mean?" "People would go out on the lake, just like you did, and never come back. Their bodies would wash up days later, pale and lifeless, their eyes wide open, staring at nothing. Some say the spirit of the lake took them, others say they drowned, but no one really knows. All I know is that those who were brave, or foolish, enough to venture out there often didn't make it back." My mind was racing. Everything Fitzgerald had said lined up with the strange events I had experienced. The shadow in the water, the feeling of something watching me, the whispering voice, it was all connected to something older, something darker. "But the lake, it's so quiet now," I said. The water seemed peaceful. He snorted. "Don't be fooled. It's always quiet before the storm. The curse never sleeps, boy. It waits. And if it wants you, there's no escaping it." I could feel the weight of his words pressing down on me. It was as though the air itself had thickened, the atmosphere growing heavier with every passing second. The lake wasn't just a body of water. It was something else entirely, alive, conscious, hungry. "But why me?" I asked. "Why is it coming after me?" Fitzgerald's eyes finally met mine, and in them I saw something I had never expected, fear. "Because you woke it. You disturbed it. The lake only reveals itself to those it wants, and you're part of the story now." I was about to ask more, but before I could speak, there was a sudden, sharp noise that cut through the air. A crackle, like something snapping in two. It came from the direction of the lake. Fitzgerald stiffened in his chair, his face paling. "You need to leave. Now." I didn't wait to hear more. I turned and ran, the gravel crunching under my feet as I made my way toward the dock. My heart pounded in my chest as I glanced nervously over my shoulder. I could feel the lake calling to me again, its silent, powerful presence tugging at the edges of my mind. The boat was waiting, unmoving on the dock. The fog had begun to creep back, rolling in from the shore like a thick blanket. I climbed into the boat, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling of dread that had settled deep in my gut. I had to go back. I had to face whatever this was, whatever had been awakened beneath the water. As I pushed off from the shore, the lake seemed to breathe with me, the ripples spraying outward like the beat of some monstrous heart. The fog thickened, swallowing the shore completely. And then I heard it again. That whisper. That voice. "Come closer." I gripped the oars tightly, my hands slick with sweat, as I rowed deeper into the mist. This time, I wasn't sure I would make it back. The further I rowed, the heavier the air seemed to become. The fog curled around the boat like fingers, pulling me deeper into the abyss. My hands shook as I gripped the oars, my breath shallow, mixing with the silence that felt suffocating. I was no longer sure where the shore had gone. The world had narrowed to nothing but the cold water beneath me and the thick mist around me. "Come closer," the voice whispered again, its tone almost melodic. It was a voice that promised both dread and comfort. My mind raced. Was it the lake itself calling to me? Was it the spirit Fitzgerald had warned me about, or something worse, something ancient and far beyond human understanding? I could hear the water lapping gently against the side of the boat, but beneath that, there was something more, something darker. The deeper I went, the more the sound began to change. It was as if the water itself was whispering. Not in words, but in strange, distorted sounds that crawled along my skin, making me tremble. The fog thickened, twisting, swirling in impossible ways, as if it were alive. I could no longer see the shore behind me, and the world seemed to fold in on itself. My thoughts became disjointed, fragmented. I didn't know how far I had gone or how much time had passed. The minutes seemed to stretch into hours, or perhaps mere seconds. Everything felt out of sync. The whisper came again, louder this time. Closer. It felt like the boat was being pulled. Not by the water, but by something else. Something unseen, something ancient. I could feel it, something was beneath the surface, moving, watching me, waiting. My heart pounded faster, my palms slick with sweat, my mind screaming at me to turn around and row back to safety. But I couldn't. There was something compelling me forward, something I couldn't ignore. It wasn't curiosity anymore, it was something primal. A need to know. A need to see what lay beneath the water's surface. I glanced over the edge of the boat. The water was dark, so dark that I could barely see my own reflection in it. But there was something moving down there, something shifting beneath the murky depths. A shape, a shadow, something so huge and unnatural that it made my breath catch in my throat. I blinked hard, but when I looked again, it was gone. Come closer. I felt the urge to obey. The voice had taken on more commanding tone. It wasn't asking anymore. It was demanding. Something in me, something deep inside, stirred. I couldn't fight it. My hands moved, pulling the oars faster, pushing me further into the heart of the lake. I didn't understand why I was doing this, but I couldn't stop. I was no longer in control. Then, the boat stopped. I couldn't explain it. One moment I was rowing, and the next the water had gone still. There was no sound, no ripple, no movement. It was as if time had frozen, as if the world had held its breath. I looked around, feeling a cold dread seep into my bones. The fog had completely swallowed me now, and I couldn't see anything at all beyond the edges of the boat. No stars, no moon, just the oppressive blackness of the lake. And then I felt it. The shift. It was subtle at first, just a tremor beneath the surface, like the lake was waking up. Slowly, but surely, I began to hear the sound of something moving beneath me. Not the gentle lapping of waves. No, this was something heavy, something massive, something far too large to belong to any ordinary creature. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breathing grew shallow. The whispering voice had grown louder. It was everywhere now, filling my mind, drowning out all rational thought. Come closer. The water began to churn, slowly at first, but then faster, more violently. I could feel the boat rocking beneath me, the waves growing stronger. I tried to row, to move, but the oars were useless. It was as if the lake itself had claimed them, pulling me deeper into its depths. A shape broke the surface. It was enormous. Too large to be any creature I had ever seen or heard of. The shadow rose from the water like a living mountain, its form shifting, its surface dark and slick, reflecting nothing but darkness. It towered above me, blocking out everything, the sky, the stars, the very world itself. I could barely see its edges. Its size was beyond comprehension. And then I saw its eyes. They were enormous, glowing faintly in the darkness, their gaze piercing straight into me, into my soul. I felt its weight on me, a pressure so heavy it felt like my chest would collapse. Its eyes were ancient, filled with an emptiness that spoke of centuries of waiting, of hunger, of things I couldn't possibly understand. The lake was alive. And it wanted me. Come closer, the voice demanded again, its tone now suffused with a deep, resonating power. The water surged around the boat, pulling me towards the center of the creature's gaze. I couldn't escape. The boat was no longer moving under my own will. The lake itself was guiding me, dragging me closer to that horrible, terrible thing. I was at the mercy of something older than anything I could imagine. I don't remember what happened next. Perhaps I fainted. Perhaps I passed out from the terror, from the overwhelming presence of the creature in front of me. But when I came to, I was lying on the shore. The fog had lifted, and the lake was calm again. Too calm, as though nothing had ever happened. But I knew it had. I knew the curse wasn't over. It had only just begun. I stood slowly, my body weak, my mind fractured. My thoughts were spinning, not knowing what was real or what I had dreamed. I looked out across the lake, but the water was still. There was no sign of the creature. No hint of the horror that had just unfolded. But I knew one thing for certain. I had seen it. It was real. And it was waiting. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.